So Tim, if you ever find this recorder, and I genuinely hope you do, because that means either you're alive or someone found both of us and thought it was worth preserving. I want you to know that I thought about calling you at least 4 times in the week before everything went completely sideways. I picked up my phone, scrolled to your name, and put it back down every single time. And now my phone is sitting on the bottom of Canal 7, somewhere near the old pumping house at Keswick Street, and I'd give probably anything to have made that call. Stupid. I'm talking into my inspection recorder, the yellow one, the waterproof Olympus I keep clipped to my vest every day for logging maintenance notes. Battery life on this thing is genuinely impressive. 14 months I've had this recorder, and I've never had to replace the batteries. It's one of those small facts I'm unreasonably attached to right now. Anyway, this is I think it's day 8. I lost track for a while in the middle because the middle was bad. I'll get to that. I'm going to try to go through this from the beginning, Tim, because I think the beginning actually matters. I think the beginning is the part where I was, looking back, paying attention to exactly the right things for completely the wrong reasons. So, let me start with the morning of the 12th. That was still before. That was technically normal, which I know sounds insane now, but I promise you it was. March 12th was a Tuesday, cold and overcast, the kind of morning where the canal water looks like wet concrete and everything smells like old rain and iron. I'd been on Canal 3 since about 7:30, doing a post-storm flow assessment. We'd had 3 inches of rain over the weekend, and I needed to check the condition of the north sluice gates and the bank stabilization at the Marsh Road crossing. Standard stuff. Nothing I hadn't done 500 times. I was in the Kayak because the access road on the north side of Canal 3 had a section of undermined culvert that hadn't been repaired yet, and I'd flagged the truck as off-limits to that stretch. So I was paddling the assessment, which honestly I prefer anyway. You get a completely different picture from the water than you do from the bank. You can see the angle of sediment deposit, the erosion patterns at the base of the gates, the way the water interacts with the infrastructure, all the stuff that looks fine from the road and is quietly failing from 6 inches above the surface. 14 years I've been doing this job. I know the canals of Harwick the way some people know their own apartments. Every lock, every gate, every section of bank that's solid, and every section that's been giving me trouble. Canal 3, from the river intake to the Marsh Road junction, I could paddle that blindfolded. Canal 7 gets weird past the second lock because there's a backwater from the old mill race that nobody's completely mapped, and I've been submitting paperwork about that for 3 years. Canal 4 is my favorite because it's the oldest section. Original Victorian stonework on the lower banks, carved cornerstones with dates from the 1870s, and the water moves differently through old stone than it does through modern poured concrete. I don't know why, exactly, but it does. Anyway, I was on Canal 3 at about 9 in the morning, and I was doing my gate checks, writing numbers into the recorder, flow rates, gate seal conditions, noting some minor cracking at the base of Gate 3 North 2 that was going to need a crew out by summer, and I noticed the boat. Old aluminum flat bottom, the kind of thing you see tied up under every bridge in the city. It was drifting, slowly, in the middle of the canal. Engine running. You could hear it from 50 yards, that put-put sound of a small outboard at idle. No one in it. Just drifting along with the current, engine going, a fishing rod propped up in the stern mount with the line trailing in the water behind it. I took a photo for the incident report and called it into Patty. Patty Kessler is my dispatcher. Has been for about 9 years. She has a voice like she's perpetually 3 hours from a cigarette break, and she'd never not heard everything. I call in a drifting boat, and she says, "Okay, description and location." And I give her that, and she says, "Been getting a lot of these lately." And I said, "What do you mean a lot?" And she said, 6 calls this week about unoccupied or abandoned vehicles and watercraft. 3 were on the river. 2 were road vehicles found running and empty near the canal district. She said city dispatch is attributing it to the recent cold snap, people leaving things running to keep them warm and then forgetting or going inside. I said it was March, it was 41 degrees. You didn't need to keep a boat engine running in 41 degrees. She said, "Owen, I'm just telling you what city dispatch said." I made a note about the boat in my report, flagged it for the harbor master, and kept going. Checked Gate 3 North 2, rode up the crack, paddled back to the access road. I didn't think much more about it until I got to the Marsh Road Bridge at about 11, and there was a man standing at the water's edge. He was wearing dress clothes, blue Oxford shirt, dark slacks, good shoes. Not the kind of person you typically see at the bank of Canal 3 in Harwich, which runs through about 2 miles of light industrial, and then under the Marsh Road overpass, past what used to be a rendering plant. He was just standing there at the concrete edge, maybe 6 feet from the water, looking at it. I came around the corner of the bank and called out, standard thing, because the bank is technically city property, and civilians aren't supposed to be down there without reason. And he didn't respond at all, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge that I'd said anything. I called again. Owen Delaney, City Waterways Maintenance. You all right there? Nothing. I thought he might have headphones in, or he was hard of hearing. The rendering plant used to generate a lot of ambient noise, and some of the older residents in the neighborhood had that factory proximity hearing loss. So I paddled closer, got within about 20 feet of him, and called out again. He turned around then, and his face was wrong, Tim. I don't know how to describe it except to say, wrong. Not injured, not drunk, just wrong. The way he was looking at me was like something that had heard a sound but didn't know what sounds meant. His mouth was moving a little, just slightly, like he was trying to remember words. There was blood on his collar, dry, dark brown, not a fresh injury, and his hands were at his sides, and he was very, very still otherwise, except for those almost moving lips. I said, "Sir, do you need medical assistance?" He took a step toward the canal. I backed the kayak up, not running, just putting space between us. Something about the way he moved. The step wasn't deliberate in the way a person moves toward something they want. It was more like he'd heard the word, and his body decided that toward was the right direction. He took another step. The edge of the concrete was right there. He didn't look down at it or hesitate. He went straight into the water. Not a jump, not a fall. Just walked off the edge, like the edge wasn't there. The canal at Marsh Road is about 8 feet deep at center, and maybe 4 at the bank. He went in up to his chest, and the cold hit him, and he stopped. And for a second I thought, okay, maybe the shock will shake whatever that is out of him. I was already pulling out my phone to call 911. But he didn't react to the cold. He just stood there in the water up to his chest, looking at me. And then he started walking toward me through the water, which was maybe the most unsettling thing I'd seen in 14 years on this job. And the bar for unsettling on a canal inspection job is not actually that low. I paddled hard and got clear of him. He stopped when I was out of range, 20, 25 feet, and then he just stood there, in the water, in 40-degree water in March in his dress clothes. I called 911 and reported it. They said they'd send someone. I don't know if they did. That was March 12th. That was the morning of the 12th. In the afternoon, I got dispatched to check the outflow conditions at the Canal 4 junction because the rain had pushed debris into the grating at the south intake. Routine. Canal 4 is closer to my regular base, the Water Infrastructure Maintenance Station, WIMS 4, which is a floating platform structure moored to the canal bank about 300 yards south of the old iron bridge. My name for it is just the station. It's not glamorous. It's a flat-bottomed barge, maybe 40 feet by 20 feet, with a corrugated metal shelter built on top of it that houses equipment, basic tools, a maintenance log office, fuel drums for the workboats, and a changing room with a toilet that runs off the city sewer connection at the bank. We have electricity from a bank line. We have a hand pump fresh water feed from the main. It smells like hydraulic oil and old rope, and the particular dusty smell of paper maintenance manuals that nobody has opened in years. I'd been using that station as my regular lunch stop and secondary equipment cache for the last 4 years. It was just convenient, easy to moor up to when I was doing the Canal 4 checks. I kept a spare dry bag there, some extra recording media, a few tools that were too heavy to carry in the kayak all day. I'd eaten 1,000 lunches in that little corrugated office, sitting at the workbench with a thermos of coffee, looking at the canal through the gap in the roll-up door. I tell you all this so you understand that I knew that station. It wasn't new to me. What I'm about to describe happened in a place I'd been in 100 times, and that somehow makes it weirder. I pulled up to the station at about 1:30 to drop off the morning inspection notes and grab lunch. When I stepped onto the platform from the Kayak, I noticed the station door was unlocked. I keep it locked. I'm particular about the station, not because anything valuable is in there, but because canal stations attract transient people sometimes, and I'd had my fuel drums siphoned twice in the past, and wasn't interested in a third time. The padlock was hanging open on the hasp. The door was just resting shut, not latched. I pushed it open and there was a man inside, sitting against the wall behind the workbench, in the dark. He looked up when the light came in. He wasn't infected. I need to be clear about that, because everything that came before and after this is going to make you wonder. He was not infected. He was just scared. He was maybe 25, wearing a city parks department jacket, and he looked like he hadn't slept in about 30 hours. His name was Brendan. I got that much out of him. Brendan, who worked for the parks department, who'd been doing early morning maintenance at Harwick River Park when something happened at the North Trailhead. He said a group of people came out of the tree line. He said they were moving wrong. He said he ran for his truck, and one of them got to the window before he could get it locked, and he drove, and kept driving until the truck ran out of gas on the service road, and he walked to the canal and found the station, and got the door open with a screwdriver from his belt. I gave him food. I had a sandwich and a bag of pretzels, and a water bottle in my bag. I let him sit in the station. I called it into Patty, who by this point was starting to sound less like herself. Her usual, "This is all fine" dispatcher voice was getting an edge on it. She said she'd been getting calls from 3 different field inspectors about people behaving strangely near water infrastructure. She said city emergency management had put out an internal bulletin about aggressive behavior incidents related to what they were calling a possible contaminated substance outbreak affecting people in the river district. Contaminated substance. That's what they called it on March 12th. I said, "Patty, do I need to bring operations in off the water?" She said she'd been told by her supervisor that normal operations should continue, and inspectors should simply avoid close contact with affected individuals and report any sightings. I said, "Patty, one of these people walked into the canal this morning." She said she'd note that in the dispatch log. There was a pause, and then she said, quietly, like she was saying it with her hand around the receiver, "Owen, go home early today. The long way." That's the last conversation I had with Patty. I took Brendan, who by this point was shaking slightly, not from cold, just from whatever adrenaline comes after the kind of fear that burns you out completely. I took him up to the station main road in my truck and pointed him toward the transit hub at Riverside and told him to get on the first bus going anywhere. I don't know if he made it. I really hope he made it. He seemed like the kind of kid who would have been annoying at a normal job, a little too eager, talked too much, and I mean that as a compliment actually. Annoying in the best possible way. I drove home, the way Patty suggested, the long way, through the industrial north roads, not through the river district. I noticed some things on the drive that I noted but didn't fully process yet. Because that's what you do, right? You note things and file them away, and tell yourself there's a reasonable explanation. There were 2 cars stopped in the middle of Chandler Avenue, doors open, nobody in them. There was a group of people gathered outside the entrance to the Marsh Road Community Center, and the way they were gathered was wrong. Not like a crowd waiting for something, more like leaves at a drain point, just accumulated there without intention, sort of eddying around the entrance without going in or out. One of them turned and looked at my truck as I went past, and I kept going. I got home. I ate whatever was in my fridge, leftover rice, some pulled pork from the container I'd had in there since Saturday. I watched about 20 minutes of the local news, which had a segment about isolated incidents of aggressive public behavior in the River District, which they attributed to a possible drug outbreak. The anchor said City Health Department was on the scene, and that residents near the River District should shelter in place until further notice. Shelter in place. I remember thinking, that's a weird phrase for a drug outbreak. I went to bed. I had a hard time sleeping, partly because of the day, and partly because I could hear sirens in a direction I don't usually hear sirens from. Not the normal downtown side sirens. These were coming from the east, from the river district. They ran pretty much all night, and then sometime around 3 in the morning they stopped. And the stopping was somehow worse than the sirens. The 13th was a Thursday. That was the last day of the before. I went into work. I know how that sounds now. But at 6:30 in the morning of March 13th, the situation was, officially, a public health incident of unknown substance abuse origin in a 2-block radius near the river district. That was the official situation. I had canal gates to check. I drove to the maintenance yard, loaded the truck, and headed out. Canal 7 was my route that morning. Canal 7 is the eastern arm, runs parallel to the old freight rail line, relatively industrial. Not many residential buildings directly on the bank until you get to the upper bend near Corley Street. I started at the intake station and worked south. The first hour was almost normal. Cold, gray, a little foggy. The water was still running high from the weekend rain. I got through the first 3 gate checks without incident. My radio, the city radio, not my personal phone, was busy in a way it usually wasn't. With dispatch traffic I wasn't directly involved in. Lot of codes I didn't recognize. Field units being redirected. I kept working. At about 8:15 I was at the bend near Corley Street, and I heard it before I saw anything. Screaming. Somewhere in the residential blocks north of the canal. Then more noise. Not words. Just noise. The indistinct roar of something bad happening to a lot of people at once. And then I came around the bend, and there were infected. I'm going to call them that because that's what they turned out to be. And I hate the other word, I'm not going to use it. There were infected on the canal bank. A dozen of them at least. And they were moving toward the noise from the north. They didn't look at me. I was in the water in the kayak, low profile, moving slow. They were tracking something north of them, that noise. And they moved toward it with the same stumbling, wrong-footed gait I'd seen on the man at Marsh Road. Not running. Just moving with intent, like water filling a space. I stopped paddling, held the paddle across my knees, sat completely still in the middle of Canal 7, and watched them go north. When the last one had moved past the bend and out of sight, I sat there for probably another full minute, just breathing. And I thought, okay, this is what this is. I didn't go north. I didn't try to help whoever was making that noise. And I have sat with that decision every single day since. And I'm not going to pretend it was clean, or easy, or heroic. It was survival arithmetic at the most basic level. 12 infected between me and whoever needed help, me in a kayak with a paddle and a multi-tool. The math was what it was. I went south instead. I paddled hard, quiet strokes, staying in the center of the channel, where the draft was deepest, and the infected on the banks would have the most water between us if they noticed me. I went south and I thought about what I had in my inspection kit, and what I had in the truck, and where the truck was parked and whether I should try to get to it. I decided the truck could wait. The truck was parked on the Corley Street access road, which was now somewhere between me and a group of infected heading north. The canal was the safest thing I had. I kept paddling south. That was the morning of the 13th. That was when I understood what the next days were going to look like. What I had in the kayak, right then, on day 1 of actually understanding what was happening. My inspection vest, which had pockets. In those pockets, the yellow voice recorder, my multi-tool, a waterproof notebook and 2 pens, a headlamp with fresh batteries, a small packet of cable ties, a roll of yellow flagging tape, 2 granola bars, and a gel packet from my lunch bag, a half-liter water bottle, my city radio, and my personal phone, which was at that point still working. In my dry bag, strapped behind the seat, a rain jacket, a wool underlayer, a basic first aid kit with bandages and ibuprofen, and some compression tape, a spare headlamp, 3 spare battery packs, a pair of leather work gloves, and the inspection tablet, with about 40% battery, that I used for digital field notes. The kayak itself, a Current Designs Pachena, 12 feet, sit-on-top design, orange, which I was now realizing was maybe not ideal for not being seen, but was excellent for not capsizing. My paddle was a carbon fiber piece, Good, light, quiet, if I feathered it correctly. That was what I had. No food beyond 2 granola bars. No real weapons. The multi-tool has a 3-inch blade that I've used mainly to strip wire insulation. No proper shelter. No plan. What I did have was 14 years of knowledge of exactly where every canal in Harwick went, what every lock and gate and junction and access point looked like from the water, where the overhanging bridges created dry spaces, where the maintenance platforms were, where fuel was stored, where equipment was cached. That was more than I realized at the time. Took me a couple more hours to figure out what I actually had. I paddled south on Canal 7 toward the junction with the main navigation canal. The junction is under the old iron railway bridge, which has a narrow clearance at normal water levels, about 4 feet between the surface and the underside of the decking. With the canal running high from the rain, it was closer to 3. I had to lie back flat in the kayak to get under it, which I've done before, but usually not in a hurry. I came through the junction into the navigation canal and turned west, back toward Wims 4, back toward the station. The canal was empty, no boat traffic. Not that there'd been much legitimate boat traffic on the navigation canal for the past decade anyway. Mostly just pleasure craft on summer weekends and the occasional barge from the old aggregate yard that still operated at the eastern end. But even the usual absence felt different now. The navigation canal runs through the heart of the lower city for about 2 miles, with the built-up residential streets right up to the bank on the south side and the backs of commercial buildings on the north. Normally you'd hear traffic, voices, music from somewhere. What I heard was sirens and, once, somewhere above me, someone yelling from a 3rd-floor window. I didn't look up. I just paddled. I reached the station at about 9:45, tied up, got onto the platform, went inside. There was a part of me, and I know this sounds ridiculous, there was a genuine part of me that felt relieved to be inside that corrugated metal shed, even though it smelled like oil and old rope, and the toilet never flushed cleanly, and the single strip light in the ceiling flickered every few minutes, for no reason I'd ever been able to diagnose. It was mine. I knew exactly where everything was in it, and it was floating, which meant it had water between it and the bank was the problem. I sat down at the workbench and made myself think clearly. That was hard. My hands were doing the thing where they shake slightly, when adrenaline doesn't have anywhere to go. I gripped the edge of the bench and breathed. What did I know? I knew the infection, whatever it was spreading faster than anything the city was prepared for. The news last night had called it an isolated incident. That was wrong. Canal 7 alone, in the space of 1 morning inspection, I'd seen at least 15 infected people. The sound from the north near Corley Street had been significant. Not just 1 person or 2. Something larger. I knew the infected tracked sound. The man at Marsh Road had turned toward me when I spoke. The group on Canal 7 had moved north toward the noise. They weren't responding to visual cues. I'd sat still in a bright orange kayak in the middle of the canal, and they hadn't looked at me because I'd been silent. I knew the infected didn't seem to understand water. The man at Marsh Road had walked off the bank without hesitation, but once he was in, and I moved away, he'd stopped. He hadn't swum after me. He'd just stood there until the current probably knocked him over. If they were following sound, and sound traveled differently through water, through the air over water, through the stone walls of the canal, maybe the water was a kind of interference. That was the beginning of the theory. I'd refine it over the next few days. But right then, sitting at the workbench, I started to understand that the water was not just a transport route. It was a barrier. A genuinely confusing barrier for whatever the infection had done to the neurological systems driving those people. I also knew that the station was maybe 30 feet from the canal bank, moored on a swing arm that I could detach fairly easily if I needed to push the whole platform out into the center of the channel. The swing arm was designed to allow the platform to accommodate water level changes without straining the mooring points. It could pivot out maybe 15 feet before the safety chain stopped it. 15 feet of water between the edge of the platform and the bank. I started making lists. That's just what I do. You can ask Diane. I make lists for everything. When we were married, she used to tease me about it. Owen's list making, she called it. With affection, but also a little exasperation, because sometimes I'd make a list instead of just doing the thing. She wasn't wrong. But right now, list-making felt like the sanest activity available. List 1. What was in the station? I went through every cabinet, every storage bin, every corner of the equipment room. I wrote it all down. Hydraulic maintenance fluid, 2 5-gallon drums. Not useful except as a fire accelerant if I was desperate, which I noted. Fuel, 3 20-gallon drums of diesel for the workboats, and 1 10-gallon drum of petrol for the small outboard engine that was stored in the equipment room, and which I'd used maybe 4 times in 3 years, because I preferred the Kayak. 3 70-gallon total diesel, 10 petrol. The station had 2 workboats, flat-bottomed aluminium, both about 12 feet, moored on the east side of the platform. I hadn't started them in 6 weeks, and I had no idea if they'd run. I put that on the list to check. Tools, standard maintenance kit, angle grinder, cordless drill, bolt cutters, crowbar, assorted wrenches and sockets, wire cutters, voltage tester. The bolt cutters were going to be useful. I didn't know for what yet specifically, but they were going on the priority list. In the office cabinet, 3 ring binders of maintenance logs going back 6 years, 2 boxes of water-resistant marker pens, a roll of engineering drafting paper, spare batteries in various sizes, a portable radio with city channel capability, a box of assorted PPE, including nitrile gloves and safety glasses, and, this was the one I felt genuinely good about, a city waterway infrastructure map binder. Full city canal and waterway system, all 12 canals, the river connections, the major lock and gate positions, the maintenance access points, the flood control structures, updated to 18 months ago. That map binder. I hugged it, Tim. I actually sat there and held it against my chest for a second like an idiot, because a paper map of the entire canal system was, in that moment, one of the most valuable things I could possibly have had. Food and water. This was the gap. The station had a hand soap dispenser, a kettle, 8 instant coffee packets, a bag of sugar. That was it. The fresh water feed from the main was still running. I could hear the pressure in the pipes when I turned the tap, which meant the water mains were still pressurized somewhere upstream. That might not last. I filled every container I could find. The kettle, 2 empty hydraulic fluid drum lids that I washed out thoroughly, 4 of the empty water bottles in the recycling bin. I had maybe 40 liters of fresh water stored in about 20 minutes. Not enough for any significant time, but something. I also knew from my inspection routes that the Canal District had several food-adjacent locations within kayak range. The Harwick Canal Visitor Center on Canal 1, now closed for the season, but with a vending area. The Boathouse Cafe at the Canal 3 Heritage Lock, also seasonally closed but with a service pantry. The maintenance yard at the north end of the navigation canal had a kitchenette with a commercial refrigerator I knew the code for, 4417, hadn't changed in 6 years. And closer, maybe 800 meters east by canal, the old Sutherland grain elevator, which I knew was partially converted to storage for a food distribution company and might have supplies. I marked all of these on the map in red marker. Then I sat down with the portable radio and listened. The city radio was chaos, not organized chaos, genuine, cascading, disintegrating chaos. Dispatch channels were overloaded. There were units going off-air mid-sentence. I heard a fire department unit reporting that they couldn't get through to command because command had gone dark. I heard a police unit calling for backup at the North River Bridge and getting no response. I heard, once, what might have been a military frequency, short, coded, not in any format I recognized, and then it went quiet. At about 11 in the morning, city radio went off completely. Not static, not interference, just off. Like someone turned it off at the source. I sat with the dead radio for a minute. Then I went and checked the outboard engine on the workboats. Both of them started after some convincing. The portside one had a fuel line that needed clearing and ran rough for a minute before smoothing out. The starboard one was fine. I ran them both for 30 seconds to confirm they worked, then shut them off because I didn't want the noise and I didn't want to burn fuel I didn't know when I'd be able to replace. The workboats were backup. The Kayak was primary. Quieter, lighter, lower profile, and I could manage it alone without difficulty. The workboats I'd use for bulk transport if I needed them. Day 1 ended with me sleeping in the station's equipment room, on an inflatable camping mat I found rolled up behind the tool cabinet, someone's emergency camping gear, forgotten here years ago. With the station door latched from inside, the swing arm pushed out to about 12 feet from the bank using the motorized winch, and the 2 kayak paddles resting across the door handle as a simple first alert system if anything pushed from outside. I ate 1 granola bar. I drank about 1 liter of water. I lay on the camping mat listening to the canal sounds. The water moving against the hull of the station, a distant dog barking somewhere southeast, and once, from somewhere on the north bank of the navigation canal, a sound I chose not to try to identify. I thought about Diane. I thought about you, Tim. I thought about all the calls I didn't make, and I let myself be properly miserable about that for about 15 minutes. Because I think you need to give yourself the misery sometimes, instead of keeping it in the engine room, where it just runs hotter. Then I made myself stop. Then I made another list. Priorities for morning. Number 1, water supply. The tap was still running, but I didn't trust it to last. The canal water wasn't drinkable without treatment, and I had no filtration system. I needed to find a water source or a filtration method. Number 2, food. I needed to make the first run to one of the marked locations within 48 hours, or I was going to be useless. You can think fine on empty for a day. You stop thinking clearly on empty on day 2, and you start making bad decisions on day 3. Number 3, assess the perimeter. I needed to paddle the immediate area and understand what the infected distribution looked like in the canal district. Where were they concentrated? What was drawing them? Where were the gaps? Number 4, find any other survivors near the water. If I was going to be on the water, I might not be the only one who'd figured out it was safer. I fell asleep at some point after midnight with those 4 priorities in my head, and I slept badly, and woke up at about 5:15 with gray light coming through the gap at the bottom of the roll-up door. Day 2. I paddled the perimeter of the station at dawn, moving east along the navigation canal first, then looping south around the Canal 4 junction and back. The fog was thick, that cold March river fog that sits about 4 feet above the water surface and makes everything above waist height invisible from the water. I used it deliberately, staying low, barely dipping the paddle. I moved maybe 1 stroke every 4 or 5 seconds. Quiet, slower than the current. What I found on that dawn patrol: 3 infected on the north bank of the navigation canal, moving west. They weren't reacting to me. I was inside the fog layer and they were above it, and the only sound I was making was the slow dip of the paddle, which is almost nothing when you do it right. They passed maybe 30 feet north of me and never turned their heads toward the water. I filed that away. The fog was useful. Dawn and dusk, when the fog was thickest, were going to be my best patrol windows. I also noted that these infected were moving along the bank rather than across it, following some kind of line, the canal wall maybe, or a street they could hear activity on beyond the buildings. Their movement had a directionality to it, even if it didn't have explicit purpose. They flowed toward noise, the way water flows toward the lowest point. They weren't looking for things. They were pulled by things. The difference between looking and being pulled is important, Tim. It sounds like a philosophical distinction, but it's actually a survival one. Something that looks for you can wait for you in the wrong place. Something that gets pulled toward sound will always go where the sound is, which means if you control the sound, you control where it goes. I had that thought on day 2, and it took me about a week to figure out how to use it properly. I'm getting there, in order. By mid-morning of day 2, the city water pressure at the station tap had dropped to about 40% of normal. By afternoon, it was a trickle. By the following morning, it was off completely. I'd stored about 60 liters in the meantime, using every container I'd found, including a pair of 5-gallon hydraulic fluid drums that I'd scrubbed out twice with soap and let dry. My first food run was day 2, afternoon. I paddled east to the grain elevator. The Sutherland elevator is a big structure, 9 stories of old brick with the elevator machine house on top, connected at the ground level to a modern storage addition that the food distribution company had built about 12 years ago. There's a canal access door on the west face, a steel roll-up door meant for bulk deliveries by barge, and it was locked. The padlock was a serious commercial one, not something my multi-tool was going to open, but the bolt cutters from the station got through it in about 30 seconds. I pushed the door up, tied the kayak to the interior dock rail, and went in. The storage edition held dry goods, pallets of it, canned vegetables, canned beans, rice in 20-kilo sacks, pasta, cooking oil, sugar, long-life milk. The kind of food distribution stock you don't think about until it's the difference between eating and not eating. I found a hand truck in the loading area, loaded it with 2 30-kilo sacks of rice, 4 cases of canned vegetables, 2 cases of beans, 3 bottles of cooking oil, and an industrial container of salt. I also found, in a small break room near the loading dock office, a coffee maker and 4 bags of whole bean coffee, which felt genuinely important, for reasons I can't entirely defend to you as rational, but I'm not apologizing for. The problem was getting all of this back to the station in a 12-foot kayak. The workboats were the answer. I'd need to bring one, but that meant engine noise. I thought about it for a few minutes, then decided to cache the food inside the grain elevator and make multiple kayak trips. I could carry 2 cases of canned goods per trip without destabilizing the kayak. It handles about 150 pounds of cargo fine if you balance it properly. I made 3 trips that afternoon, moving fast and quiet each time, keeping to the center of the canal and listening hard. By end of day 2, I had food for about 3 weeks at conservative rationing. Water was still the problem. The water solution came on day 3, from a source I genuinely should have thought of on day 1, but didn't, because I was thinking about food and perimeter and all the things that weren't water. Rain. I had an enormous amount of clean waterproofing on the station. The corrugated metal roof, the rubber-edged platform decking, the vinyl tarpaulins stored in the equipment room. Rain falls on Harwick in March routinely. What I needed was a collection system. I spent the morning of day 3 building one. I strung 2 of the large tarps at an angle from the top of the station roof down to a collection point at the platform edge, using rope from the mooring locker and the toolkit to create gutters along the edges. At the low point of each tarp, I placed one of the clean hydraulic drums. I rigged a simple overflow pipe from the first drum to the second, using a length of rubber tubing from the plumbing kit. It rained that afternoon for 2 hours. I collected about 35 liters. Honestly, that was a better feeling than the food. Water is the thing that gets you first. Food takes weeks to kill you. Dehydration takes days. 35 liters in 2 hours meant the collection system worked, and March in Harwick means rain is not a theoretical resource. I also found, on day 3, that the canal water itself could be made usable with a fairly basic process. I didn't have a commercial filter, but I knew from my work that canal water in this section had relatively low biological contamination, because the Harwick Canal system has a good flushing rate when the gates are operating normally. The spring rainfall keeps the flow moving. I boiled it for 10 minutes on the small electric kettle, then let it settle, then boiled it again. It tasted like warm stone and something green. It didn't make me sick. That was the goal. Between collected rainwater and boiled canal water, I could manage. I wasn't comfortable, but I could manage. And on day 3, comfortable wasn't the benchmark I was using. I spent the afternoon of day 3 on what I called my first perimeter assessment. I paddled the full circuit of the navigation canal and canals 3 and 4, about 5 miles total, taking notes in the waterproof notebook and marking the map. What I found. The infected were concentrated in 2 areas. The first was the north bank of the navigation canal near the Chandler Road crossing. I counted at least 40 from a safe distance, gathered in the street above the canal bank in a rough cluster. They seemed to be anchored there by some sound from the apartment buildings on Chandler. The second concentration was at the Canal 3 and Canal 7 junction, the Marsh Road area where I'd seen the man go into the water 2 days before. From the water, I could see maybe 20 or 30 on the banks above the junction, moving in the same slow, directionless pattern I was getting used to seeing. Between these 2 concentrations, the canal banks were mostly empty. A few isolated individuals moving along streets visible from the water. Nothing close to the bank edges. More importantly, no living people on the banks. Nobody trying to get to the water. Nobody signaling from windows. That last thing, the no one signaling part, that worried me more than the infected clusters. Either everyone in the buildings around the canal was hiding well enough that they weren't visible from the water, or the early spread had been fast enough to take out most of the accessible population before they could make it to the water's edge. I was hoping for the first option. I paddled slower on the way back to the station, thinking. The city was divided now by two things: the flood and the infected. The flood was the thing I hadn't mentioned yet, because I was trying to keep this in order, and the flooding was slightly after the first days, but it was already starting by day 3. Harwick's canal system is connected to the Harwick River at 3 points. The river had been running high since the weekend rain, and without anyone actively managing the flood control gates, without inspectors like me monitoring the gate positions and adjusting for river level, the river was pushing back into the canals. The downstream sections of Canal 3 and Canal 7 were already running about 2 feet above normal level. The lower streets in the Riverbend district, Southgate, Old Harbor, were showing water in the road surfaces, from what I could see at the junction bridges. By day 5, parts of those neighborhoods would be under 3 feet of water. And this is where I need to tell you about something I noticed on day 3 that didn't make sense to me until day 7, which is when I found the first gate. The north sluice on Canal 3, the one I'd been checking on the morning of the 12th, was open. Not cracked, not stuck at partial position. Fully open, wide open, the way you'd only open it deliberately during a controlled flood event. I'd logged it at about 40% flow on the morning of the 12th. 3 days later, it was 100%. I thought at first it had failed. Gate failure happens, the seals degrade, the actuator motor gives out, and the gate relaxes to full open under the pressure. That's a thing that occurs. I made a note to check the actuator housing when I could. But then I checked Gate 3 South 1, which should have been counterbalanced. If the north gate was fully open, the south gate on the same canal section should have gone to the compensating position, about 70%, to maintain downstream flow rates. Instead, it was closed. Fully closed. That configuration doesn't happen from mechanical failure. A failed gate relaxes. It doesn't go to a different position than it was in. Someone had closed Gate 3 South 1 after opening Gate 3 North 1. Someone who knew what those two gates did in combination, which was push maximum river water into the upper section of Canal 3 with nowhere for it to go except over the banks. The upper section of Canal 3 runs directly through the Southgate neighborhood. Someone was deliberately flooding Southgate. I sat with that for a while, floating between the two gates with the water running fast on either side of me, and I tried to come up with an alternative explanation. Equipment malfunction affecting two gates simultaneously, in a way that happened to create a deliberate flooding pattern. Possible but improbable. Coincidental positioning by city workers before the outbreak, just bad luck? Also possible. I made a note. Checked the actuator housing on Gate 3 North 1. The actuator was intact. The motor was warm. The gate had been operated recently, electrically, using the manual override panel on the North Bank access point. Someone had driven to the access point and used the manual override to open that gate. I photographed the actuator housing and the override panel with my phone and noted it in the waterproof notebook and told myself it was something to investigate when I wasn't still figuring out how to stay alive. I marked the gate positions on the map with a different colored marker, red for infrastructure of concern. That was day 3. The gate thing was sitting in the back of my head, but the front of my head was occupied with more immediate problems. Specifically, I'd been alone for 3 days, and I was starting to hear my own voice differently, like it was coming from someone else. You know how you sound to yourself normally? You don't, or you do, but in a way you take for granted, the background hum of your own thoughts. After 3 days of talking only into the recorder, the way my voice was recording back to me was starting to feel like the only real feedback I was getting on whether I was thinking straight, which meant I needed other people, and I needed them soon, not just for company, though yes, also for company, but because isolation has a genuinely degenerative effect on your reasoning, and I could feel it starting at the edges. I found the Brentwood family on day 4. I was doing my morning patrol, going east this time, along Canal 2, which I hadn't checked yet. Canal 2 runs through a residential neighborhood, the Mill Park area, 2- and 3-story row houses, A school, a small park with a playground. Nice area. The kind of place where people have well-maintained gardens above the canal walls and complain to their council representative about water quality. My notes from Canal 2 are full of letters from residents about algae and access, and the view from their back terraces. I came around the Mill Park bend at about 8 in the morning, and the street level was about a foot above normal flood height. The Canal 2 connection to Canal 3 was allowing backwater in, and in the second row of houses above the bank, a second-floor window was open, and there was a sheet hanging out of it, with the words "Help Us" written in what looked like kids' red finger paint. I pulled into the canal wall shadow under the overhang of the Mill Park Road Bridge and looked for a while before I moved. The canal bank at Mill Park has a walkway on the west side, low stone wall, access steps down to the water. 3 infected were on the walkway, moving west, not looking at the water. Once they rounded the bend, I waited another 2 minutes. Nothing. I paddled to the access steps and tied up and went up. The house was number 14, matching the window position. I knocked on the front door quietly. 2 light raps. Nothing. I knocked again, listened. A child's voice from inside, close to the door. "Dad, someone's at the door." A man's voice hushed. "How many?" "Child, just one. He's by himself. He looks like a worker." A pause. Then the door opened about 2 inches on a security chain, and a man's eye was there in the gap, 30-something, beard, like he'd been awake for days because he had been. I said, "I'm a city waterway inspector. I'm not infected. I have a kayak on the canal. Are you okay?" He stared at me for a second. Then the chain came off. Ray Brentwood, his wife Julie, their daughter Mia, 6 years old, who had written the sign, and their son Cody, 9, who had been the voice by the door. Ray was a dentist. Julie had taught kindergarten before taking time off after Mia. They'd been in the house since the morning of the 13th when they'd heard their neighbors, the Kellermans, across the street, and then seen what happened and pulled the kids inside, and locked everything and piled furniture against the ground floor windows. 4 days in that house. They had about a day's worth of food and no running water because the mains had gone off and they'd drunk everything they'd had in bottles and pots. I sat at their kitchen table, which was also their main floor barricade, pushed against the back door, and we talked for about 20 minutes. I told them what I knew, which wasn't much, but was more than they had. They told me what they'd seen from the window, the street-level infected moving east toward Chandler, the early flooding, a neighbor 2 doors down who'd been on their roof for a day before the roof group went quiet. Mia Brentwood asked me if I had anything to eat, and I gave her the second granola bar from my vest, which I'd been rationing, and which I was very glad to give her, even though it was the last thing I had on me. She ate it in about 4 bites and then said, with complete seriousness, that it wasn't as good as the ones her mom made, and Julie made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one, and for a second, the kitchen felt like a place where people lived, rather than just survived. Getting 4 people in a kayak is not a thing that happens. Getting 4 people in a 12-foot sit-on-top kayak is specifically not a thing. I had the 2 workboats, but the engine noise was a problem. We talked about it. Ray suggested we paddle the workboats. They had oars in the equipment locker, he thought, because he'd seen oar locks on the transom when I described the station. He was right. I hadn't thought to check. Problem 2, getting them to the water. The canal access steps were maybe 30 meters from the front door of number 14, along a street that had 3 infected, visible from the upstairs window at any given time, moving west along the walkway. We waited. We waited for about 2 hours, watching from the upstairs window, tracking the infected patterns. What I noticed in that 2 hours, and this was the thing that mattered, was that the infected on the Mill Park walkway were all moving west. They'd come around the east bend of the canal in small clusters, or individually, walk west along the walkway, and disappear around the west corner, all of them, all in the same direction. Something west of us was making sound. I didn't know what, but it was pulling them, and they were following it. And the eastern end of the canal walkway, the stretch between the access steps and the east bend, was consistently clear for windows of about 4 to 6 minutes. 4 to 6 minutes. I needed 3. We moved at 2 in the afternoon. Julie had the kids' backpacks loaded, food from their remaining supplies, a change of clothes for each kid, Mia's stuffed elephant, which was non-negotiable, and I supported that entirely. Ray had a bag with practical things, first aid kit, a utility knife, a hand crank flashlight, a box of kitchen matches. Julie carried Mia. Cody walked on his own. 9-year-old Cody, who kept his face completely straight the whole time, and walked at Ray's heel, like he'd been doing this his whole life. I went first, clear, waved them out. 30 meters to the steps, no noise. Mia, with her face buried in Julie's neck. I checked the east bend, empty. Checked west. 3 infected around the corner, out of sight. All 4 of them on the steps in under 2 minutes. I untied the kayak and helped Ray lower Mia into the bow of the kayak. She sat there with her knees against her chest, and Cody sat behind her, and I paddled them to the station while Ray and Julie took the workboat, oar silent, moving together, without me having to explain anything, because Ray was that kind of person. I've thought about that movement a lot, actually. From the house to the water in under 3 minutes. No noise, no panic. Ray was scared. His hands were shaking on the oar, but he was functioning completely. He kept it together. And Julie had a 6-year-old pressed against her chest, and she still timed the corner clearing correctly and didn't hesitate at the top of the steps. People are capable of a lot when the arithmetic is clear enough. We got to the station. The Brentwoods settled into the equipment room, which was suddenly much smaller, but also suddenly much more full of the sounds of other people breathing, and a 9-year-old investigating every cabinet in the place with complete focus. I showed them the food supply. I showed them the water system. I showed them the map. Cody looked at the map for about 30 seconds and said, "Why are these gates marked in red?" "Because someone's been operating them wrong," I said. He said, "Is that bad?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How do you know it wasn't just broken?" And I explained the dual gate configuration and why you couldn't get from a stuck gate in one position to a functioning gate in the opposite position without someone manually intervening. I wasn't sure why I was explaining this to a 9-year-old in this much detail, but he was asking, and he was paying attention, and honestly, it was good to be talking to someone about it. He thought about it for a second and said, "So someone wanted that neighborhood to flood?" "Yes," I said, "I think so." He nodded, like that was information to file away, and went back to exploring the cabinet. The Brentwoods being there changed the dynamics of the station considerably and almost entirely for the better. Ray was practically minded in the way that people who work with their hands are practical. Dentistry sounds like an unlikely background for canal survival logistics, but the man could troubleshoot a water collection problem and had a systematic approach to problems that matched mine well. Julie turned out to have very practical knowledge about food. She'd been growing vegetables before this, knew how to stretch ingredients, knew calorie density intuitively from years of planning children's meals. Cody was observant and quiet and didn't require entertainment. Mia was 6 and wanted to know everything about everything and kept asking questions I didn't have answers to, which was fine, honestly. The questions kept the adults talking and thinking. Having them there also gave me better coverage for patrols. While I was out on the canal, Ray was watching from the station and would signal with the workboat's small signal mirror if anything approached the platform. We worked out a simple system of signals. 1 flash meant incoming from the east, 2 from the west, 3 from the south. 3 was the one that would mean get back now, because I was approaching from the south on almost every patrol. On day 5, I found Nadia. Nadia Holst was on the fire escape of a 4-story building on Canal 4, about 400 meters east of the station. She'd been there since day 2. She was a nurse, emergency medicine, had been on her way to Harwick General when the roads became impassable, and she'd ended up trying to cut through the residential streets and gotten herself above the flood line on that fire escape when the Southgate flooding pushed water through the ground floor of the building she was crossing through. She was in scrubs, still. Blue hospital scrubs with the Harwick General logo on the chest pocket. She had a backpack with her medical kit, IV supplies, wound care materials, a decent first aid cache. She'd been rationing half a bag of crackers for 3 days and had collected rainwater in a surgical basin she'd found in a bin bag on the roof. When I paddled up to the fire escape and called up to her, She looked down at me with the exact expression of someone who has been measuring the likelihood of rescue against the available evidence and had not been optimistic. She climbed down the fire escape to the second-level landing. The water was above the first-level platform, and I helped her into the kayak and paddled her back to the station. In the kayak, on the way back, she told me she'd been on the phone to colleagues from Harwick General on day 1 until she lost signal. She said by the afternoon of day 1, the emergency department had been overrun. She said she'd spoken to a colleague who said the hospital was attempting lockdown. She hadn't heard from anyone since. I didn't ask her anything else about that on the water. She'd tell us what she needed to tell us when she was ready. I just paddled. At the station, Nadia ate an entire can of beans standing up and drank about a liter of water before she sat down. Then she sat down and looked at the group of us, Ray, Julie, the 2 kids, me, and said, "Okay, what's the situation?" I went through what I knew. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "I have a problem I need to tell you about." She'd been on the fire escape of that building for 3 days. On the 3rd morning, day 5 for us, day 2 for her on the escape, she'd heard someone in the building, not infected someone, talking to themselves, human someone. She'd called out, and eventually a kid had appeared on the 4th floor window above her. A teenager, 17 she estimated, male, in a Harwick Tech sweatshirt. He'd come down the fire escape to talk to her. His name was Tyler Greer. He'd been in the building when the flooding started, been separated from whoever he was with, worked his way up to the top floor. He seemed fine, she said. Alert, coherent, communicating clearly. He also had a bite wound on his left hand. Clean puncture marks, classic bite pattern. It was already infected, beginning to go red and swollen at the margins. And it had been there, he told her, since day 2, which was now 3 days ago. Everyone at the table understood what that meant. 3 days post-bite, not turned. The available data we all had from what we'd witnessed was that infected individuals seemed to go through the behavioral change fast. The man at Marsh Road had looked fresh when I'd seen him, hadn't looked like someone who'd been deteriorating for days. The timeline we were working from, based on what Nadia had seen at the hospital and what the Brentwoods had observed on their street, was that the change appeared to happen within hours. A day at the outside. 3 days was not in that framework. Tyler Greer had been bitten 3 days ago and was still Tyler Greer. Nobody said anything for a moment. Ray said, "Is he still in the building?" Nadia said, "Yes." She'd told him she was going to try to find help and come back. She hadn't had a choice about that. She'd been on the fire escape with a bag of crackers and a surgical basin. She didn't have a way to help him there. I said, "We go back and get him." Julie looked at me. Ray looked at me. Not doubtfully, exactly. More carefully. I said, "He's been bitten 3 days, and he's still functional. That is either the most dangerous thing I've encountered, or the most interesting thing. Either way, I want to know which." Nadia said she agreed. She also said she wanted to assess the wound properly. If there was an infection of the standard bacterial kind from the bite itself, separate from whatever the outbreak pathogen was, she might be able to treat it with the antibiotics in her kit, which she had. Ray said, "What if he turns while he's here?" I said that was a legitimate question and I didn't have a comfortable answer. We have the canal. We have the platform gap from the bank. If something changes with Tyler and he can't control himself, we're in a position to put him in the water, and the current does the rest. I didn't love saying that. The way it sat in the room afterward was heavy, but everyone at the table was a rational person who understood what we were dealing with, and pretending otherwise wouldn't have helped Tyler or anyone else. We went back for Tyler the next morning. Me and Nadia in the kayak, Ray in a workboat as backup. Tyler was still on the 4th floor. He came down when we called. He was lucid. He knew where he was, what had happened, roughly how long he'd been there. He was scared, and he was also, I thought this at the time, somehow calmer than a 17-year-old in his situation had any right to be. Like he'd worked something out in the days alone, and arrived at a position with it. He came in the workboat with Ray. On the way back, I watched him from the kayak. He sat in the bow of the workboat and watched the canal banks with the same careful, patient attention I'd been using on my patrols. When an infected individual appeared on the north bank at the Canal 4 junction, Tyler tracked it with his eyes and then looked away when it moved out of sight. He didn't flinch. He just processed it and moved on. At the station, Nadia cleaned and dressed the wound. The bite itself was healing. Slowly, but healing. The inflammation had reduced slightly since she'd last looked at it 3 days before. She started him on the antibiotics she had in her kit. She did a neurological assessment, standard checks, tracking, reflexes, responsiveness. All normal. She took me aside and said quietly, "I don't know what this means. In a medical sense, I genuinely don't know. Either he has some resistance that most people don't, or the timing is different for him, for some reason I can't identify without equipment I don't have." I said, "Is he a danger to the others?" She said she thought we should treat him as a potential risk while maintaining normal treatment, meaning he gets food and water and medical care, he stays on the platform, and one of us keeps eyes on him at all times. Tyler accepted that when I told him. He said he'd been worried the whole time that he was going to wake up and not be himself anymore, and that having people around who knew and were watching was actually less scary than being alone waiting to find out. He also said, 6 hours after arriving at the station, that he was pretty good with boats. He was. It turned out he'd grown up on a lake in Wisconsin and had been rowing and paddling since he was 8. Over the next 2 weeks, Tyler Greer became one of my most reliable patrol partners, which is something I did not see coming when I watched him come down a fire escape in a Harwick Tech sweatshirt with a bandaged hand 3 days after being bitten. Still thinking about that. Still not sure what it means. Day 7 was when the water in Canal 3 went fully over the South Gate banks. By this point, I'd identified 2 more gate anomalies. Gate 7 East 2, on Canal 7's eastern arm, had been closed when it should have been at 40%, which was backing water up into the industrial district east of Chandler Road. And Gate 1 South 3, on the main navigation canal's southern arm, had been cracked open, not fully, just at about 20%. Which was drawing river water into the canal section that ran along the edge of the Riverside Crest district. But there was a key difference. Gate 1 South 3 feeds a bypass that I knew went around the flood control basin at Riverside Crest's perimeter. Opening that gate slightly would actually reduce the flood pressure against Riverside Crest's protective embankment. Someone was managing the gates to protect one specific district while flooding the others. The South Gate and industrial neighborhood flooding was directing large numbers of displaced infected westward, toward the already chaotic North River District, and away from Riverside Crest. Riverside Crest is not subtle about what it is. It's the redevelopment district built on the old industrial waterfront about 12 years ago. High-end residential, waterfront restaurants, the new Civic Arts Center. I'd done gate maintenance checks near there for years, and the homeowner association had complained about my maintenance truck being an eyesore more than once. I didn't know who had done this yet, but the picture was getting clearer. On day 8, which is when I started this recording, when I said it's day 8, and I think it's day 8, we had our first close call at the station. I'd been on a food run that morning, back to the grain elevator, and I came back to find Ray at the station signal mirror, going frantic with the 2-flash west code. I was coming from the east, so I didn't initially understand why. Then I came around the Canal 4 junction, and I saw the boat. An aluminum flat bottom, same type as the abandoned one I'd seen on the 12th. It was drifting east on the navigation canal with the current, about 200 meters west of the station. There was a figure in it, slumped against the bench seat. My first thought was, survivor. Injured survivor. My second thought, about 3 seconds later as the boat got closer, that's not an injured survivor's posture. That's a position no living person adopts voluntarily. I paddled hard to intercept before the boat reached the station. I came alongside at about 100 meters out and got a look, and my second thought had been correct. The figure was infected. A man, probably in his 60s, in a canvas work jacket. He was slumped because something had happened to him. A wound on the side of his head, dried now, but he was not dead. He was breathing, eyes open, head turning slowly in the direction of my paddle entering the water. An infected person, in a boat, drifting toward my station with the current. This was a problem I hadn't thought about. Infected in the water, I'd seen. Infected on the banks I'd planned for. Infected in a moving boat that would simply arrive at my location on its own. Like a delivery. That was new. I had the bolt cutters in the workboat. I didn't have anything that could stop a boat. And I couldn't just let it drift past the station, because the current curves south at the Canal 4 junction, and the boat would have ended up pressed against the station's east side. I called out, not to the man in the boat, but back toward the station. I had about 2 minutes before the boat was at the platform. I needed Ray on the other workboat, pushing the station out on the swing arm to the full extension, so the boat would pass between the station and the bank, rather than against the platform. Ray heard me and understood immediately. He had the workboat motor running in 30 seconds, and was on the swing arm, pushing. The station platform moved out on its pivot to about 12 feet from the bank. The gap between the platform edge and the bank was 12 feet of fast-moving canal water. The drifting boat passed through that gap with about 2 feet to spare. The infected man in it turned his head toward the platform as it went past, tracked the sound of Ray's boat motor. But he was in a drifting aluminum boat with no oar or paddle, and no apparent understanding of how to change that, and the current carried him east and around the bend and out of sight. We pulled the station back in. I sat on the platform for a few minutes without saying anything. Then I said we needed a warning system further up the canal to the west, something that would give us more than 2 minutes' notice of anything coming downstream. Ray said, "What kind of warning system?" I thought about it. I had fishing line from the grain elevator supplies. I'd grabbed a tackle box from the storage area on one of my runs, thinking it might be useful. I had small bells from the kind of wind chimes that had been hanging in the grain elevator break room. I had flagging tape. I had the canal infrastructure itself. Over the next 2 days, working early morning and evening in the fog windows, I strung a series of trip-line indicators at 3 positions west of the station. Each one was a weighted fishing line stretched across the canal at about water surface level, with small aluminum reflectors above the waterline and thin wire noisemakers, the wind chime fragments, plus some bent aluminum tabs I cut from fuel drum lids that would move if the line was disturbed by a passing boat or swimmer. The line was invisible at distance because I'd used the clear monofilament from the tackle box. The reflectors were positioned at angles only visible from the station, not from the canal banks. It wasn't a sophisticated system, but it worked in the sense that anything coming downstream on the water would hit the first line and move the markers, and I could see the markers from the station roof. I also did the same on the east side, around the Canal 4 junction bend. On that side, I used a more visible system. Colored flagging tape on the bank walls, positioned in patterns that I'd memorized, so that if anything pushed the tape aside coming from the east, I'd see the pattern change from the Kayak on patrol. These things felt small at the time. I spent a lot of day 9 and 10 telling myself I was building systems, when really I was keeping busy, because keeping busy was how I stayed functional. Both things were true. Day 9 was also when I found the notebook. In the station's office area, there's a cabinet that I'd been using for map storage. When I pulled the map binder on day 1, I'd noticed the cabinet had a lower drawer that was stuck. Swollen wood. Something about the moisture in the canal environment. And I'd ignored it because I had the maps I needed. On day 9, working alone in the office while the Brentwoods were in the equipment room and Nadia and Tyler were on the platform, I got the drawer open with the crowbar. Inside, engineering documents. Old ones, the kind printed on large format paper and folded to fit into a standard cabinet. I unfolded them carefully because the paper was fragile, the kind of brittle fold you get from documents that have sat in a cabinet for decades without being touched. They were survey drawings, City of Harwick Engineering Department, dated 1952, revised 1971. The subject notation in the title block said, Combined Sewer Overflow Relief System, Secondary Tunnels, Harwick Canal District. Secondary tunnels. I stared at that for a while. Then I started reading the drawings. What they showed was this. In 1952, the city had built a secondary overflow system for the Victorian-era combined sewers that ran under the canal district. The primary purpose was flood relief during major rain events. The idea being that if the street-level sewers backed up, excess water would be routed through a secondary tunnel system that ran underground. roughly parallel to and slightly below the canal system, from the south city center northward, to the river outflow point, about 2 miles north of the main canal basin. The secondary tunnel wasn't a sewage tunnel in the regular sense. It was an overflow relief channel, essentially a brick-lined underground waterway, about 6 feet high at the crown and 4 feet wide at the waterline, that was normally dry or carrying minimal flow and only activated during major flood events when the primary sewer system reached capacity. By 1971, when the drawings had been last revised, the tunnel system had been partially decommissioned because the city had built new dedicated stormwater infrastructure that made the secondary overflow less necessary. The 1971 revision noted that sections of the tunnel had been sealed at their urban entry points, but that the structural integrity was maintained for potential future use. Structural integrity maintained for potential future use. I went through all the drawings carefully. There were 4 sheets. Sheet 1 showed the overall tunnel route. It ran from an access point in the basement of the old municipal pump house on Canal 4, south of the station, north under the Canal District, and exited at the Harwick River Channel, north of the Chandler Road Bridge. The exit point was marked as a river outfall structure on the north bank, a concrete headwall with a sealed gate. Sheet 2 showed the cross-sections. 6 feet high, 4 feet water width at normal level, brick construction with a mortar lining, reinforced at junctions with concrete collars. It was large enough to walk through, or to paddle through in a low kayak. Sheet 3 showed the entry points. There had been access hatches every 200 meters along the route, built for maintenance workers. The hatches were in various locations, some in building basements, some in canal bank structures, one in the floor of a lock chamber on Canal 4. The Canal 4 lock, Lock 4 North. I had the key to Lock 4 North on my inspection keyring. I sat with that for a very long time. Sheet 4 was the note from 1971. It said the tunnel had been inspected in 1970 and found to be in good structural condition throughout. All access hatches had been sealed or padlocked. The primary entry at the pump house had been fitted with a steel cover plate bolted to the slab. The exit headwall gate on the river had been fitted with a locking mechanism and sealed. The document noted that the tunnel could be reactivated for flood relief use by city engineering personnel, with access to the sealed entry points. City engineering personnel. I'm city engineering personnel. The inspection keyring that I carry every single day has 67 keys on it. Every lock and gate in the Harwick Canal infrastructure system, including, I now realized, a key marked 4NL that I had always assumed stood for Canal 4 North Lock Chamber Access, which it did, among other things. I didn't go straight to the lock. I sat in the office with the drawings, and I thought about what this information meant, and who else knew about it, and what the right thing to do with it was, and none of those answers were immediately obvious. What was obvious? There was potentially a passage out of the city, underground, sealed from the outside world, not accessible to the infected, not visible from the streets, leading to the North Riverbank, which from the map appeared to be outside the main concentrated zone, north of Chandler Road, north of where I'd seen the large cluster of infected. If the outfall gate could be opened from the inside, it led directly to the river. The river led north, north of the city. The infrastructure thinned out. The roads got more rural. The population density dropped. Less people meant the outbreak had fewer hosts. North was possibly, not certainly, but possibly, a direction that wasn't what the city had become. But I was getting ahead of myself. I didn't even know if the tunnel was still intact. 70 years of water table fluctuation, frost cycles, subsidence, brick deterioration. The 1970 inspection said it was fine. A 1970 inspection was now 56 years old. The flood conditions currently above ground were putting unusual pressure on underground structures. Before I did anything else with this information, I needed to assess the tunnel. And before I assessed it, I needed to be very careful about who I told and when. Day 10. I told Nadia about the tunnel drawings. Only Nadia, for now. I told her because she was a practical person who had already demonstrated the ability to assess information calmly and help think through it, and because I was making decisions that affected other people and I needed a second perspective. She read through the drawings. She asked me the right questions. What was the condition of the entry point? Had I checked the lock chamber? Was there any way to assess the tunnel's structural integrity without going in first? I said I hadn't checked anything yet. I said I was going to go to Lock 4 North on my next patrol and open the chamber access and look inside. She said, "If the tunnel is intact and the exit is openable, what are you going to do with it?" I said I didn't know yet. She said, "That's the honest answer, but you should probably start working on it before you confirm it exists. Because once you confirm it, you're going to be in a room with 5 other people who are going to have opinions about it, and having your thoughts in order before that conversation is going to help." She was right. Over the next 2 patrol days, while I was on the water doing the regular checks and supply runs, I kept thinking it through. Here was the problem. The tunnel, if it was intact, was a controlled resource. 1 exit, 200-meter spacing on access points, underground and hidden. Its value as a survival route depended entirely on it being managed carefully. If you sent 30 panicked people through an unassessed Victorian underground tunnel you didn't know the condition of, you were potentially trading one set of dangers for another. Structural collapse, flooding, disorientation underground. And if the exit gate was found by someone hostile, and by day 10, I was developing increasingly clear suspicions about who that might be, before everyone was through, you'd potentially close the only exit on your people, versus keep it as a private resource and use it selectively. Get our group through when we'd properly assessed it and prepared. But then who were we leaving behind? There were 40-plus survivors in the grain elevator that I'd been supplying. There were at least 2 other survivor groups I'd identified in the past few days from rooftop signals, and 1 radio contact. I went back and forth on this for days. I'm going to tell it in order. On day 11, I went to the grain elevator. The grain elevator was now home to what I'd started thinking of as the elevator group. I'd made 8 supply runs there by this point, dropping canned goods at the canal-level dock, calling up to get the dock access open. Over those visits, I'd developed a picture of who was up there. Somewhere between 30 and 40 people, multi-generational, a mix of people who'd been in the building when the outbreak started, and people who'd made it there in the first days. The group had organized itself around a man called Victor Strand. Victor was 53, built like a piece of furniture, had been the manager of a bar called the Anchor Lounge on the waterfront. He'd been at the elevator when it happened, because he'd been doing a delivery pickup. The bar had a storage arrangement with the food company. He'd pulled in 12 people off the street in the first hours, organized the upper floor access, established a basic security system. By the time I'd first made contact on day 5, Victor had a roster and a rationing system and had already designated a watch rotation. He also had 3 radios and had been scanning the city emergency channels for days without success. When I tied up at the canal dock on day 11, Victor came down to help unload. He was the kind of man who assessed things by looking at them, which meant he spent the first 3 seconds of every conversation looking at me in a way that I'd come to understand was not unfriendly, just informational. He said, "You're getting to know the canals better than you already did." I said I was using them. He said, "We had someone try to come across the roof from the adjacent building 2 nights ago, from the south side." I said, "Infected?" He said, "No. People. 4 of them. They had weapons. They weren't interested in talking." I asked if everyone was okay. He said we lost one of the second-floor rooms as a refuge when they forced the stairwell access. Nobody hurt, but we don't have the roof anymore, and we're all consolidated above the 3rd floor now. I said, "The people who tried to get in, what did they look like? What were they after?" He said supplies. Clearly supplies. And they had gear. Not just cobbled together, actually organized gear. 2 of them had what looked like city utility vests. City utility vests. Like the ones the waterway maintenance department wears. Like the one I was currently wearing. I didn't say anything about that immediately. I asked Victor for his best description of the 4 people. He gave it to me as precisely as he could. They'd come and gone. When the elevator group pushed back, they'd retreated the way they'd come, and Victor hadn't pursued, because the risk wasn't worth it. I added that to the mental file that was getting heavier by the day. On day 12, I did something I'd been planning carefully since day 9, which was the first attempt to assess Lock 4 North. Lock 4 North is about 600 meters east of the station, on the Canal 4 route. It's one of the older locks in the system, original Victorian stonework, oak gate beams that were last replaced in the 1990s and are due again, but keep getting pushed down the maintenance budget. The lock chamber is about 12 feet by 50 feet, stone walls, wooden gates at each end. The lockkeeper's platform is on the east wall, with the control panel and the access to the chamber stairs. The chamber itself is accessible from a metal staircase on the inside of the east wall, going down to the chamber floor when the lock is emptied. My key ring has 2 keys for the 4N complex. The first is the lock gate control panel key. The second is smaller, older, and I'd never used it in 14 years. It's an odd-looking key, heavy brass, a bit tarnished, a Victorian-era skeleton type with a bow in the shape of the City Waterways Department crest. I'd always assumed it was a legacy key for something that had been decommissioned or replaced. Something I kept on the ring because the protocol said, keep all assigned keys and decommissioned keys go into the historical asset folder, which nobody ever did, because the historical asset folder had been pending reorganization for my entire career. According to the 1952 drawings, that key opened the maintenance access in the floor of Lock 4 North's empty chamber, which led to the secondary tunnel system. I paddled to the lock on a morning with good fog, moved through the lock chamber access by the side door, went down the east wall stairs to the empty chamber floor. The chamber smelled the way old locks smell: cold stone, algae, the particular stillness of a stone room that hasn't had much air movement in a long time. In the center of the chamber floor was a hatch. I'd walked this chamber floor a dozen times over the years, and I'd seen the hatch. I'd assumed it was a drain access, the kind of thing every lock has. But looking at it now, with the drawings in my head, it was different from a drain access. It was larger, maybe 4 feet by 3 feet, with a heavy cast iron ring set into the surface. And next to the ring, almost invisible because the stone around it was the same dark color, was a keyhole, a slightly ornate keyhole, exactly the size of the Victorian brass key. I took the key off the ring. My hands were, look, let me be honest, my hands were shaking slightly. Not badly, but slightly. The key went in, turned. The lock released with a sound that I can only describe as decades old. That deep, heavy click of a mechanism that hasn't moved in a very long time, but is still fully functional, because Victorian engineers built things to last. I lifted the hatch by the ring. It was heavy, 30, 40 pounds of cast iron, and swung up on a counterbalanced pivot with a grinding that I did not love making in terms of noise. I held it at the top of its swing and listened. Nothing from outside. Nothing from the canal surface above me. Below the hatch, stone steps going down into darkness, cold air rising. The smell of it was old. Old water, old stone. The particular underground smell that isn't exactly bad, but isn't anything you've encountered above ground. Damp and mineral and deep. I put my headlamp on and went down. The tunnel was intact. I mean that specifically. The brickwork was intact. The mortar was intact. The arch overhead was intact. There was a thin film of water on the floor, an inch, maybe less, running north along the tunnel floor at a shallow gradient. The tunnel was exactly as described in the drawings. 6 feet of clearance at the crown, about 4 feet of walking width between the water and the walls. The headlamp beam went about 30 meters before the tunnel curved slightly and cut off the view. I walked about 100 meters north. The brickwork changed slightly around the 50-meter mark. There was a concrete collar, the junction reinforcement mentioned in the drawings, and then back to Victorian brick. The floor was solid. The ceiling was solid. There was a faint sound, very faint, of water running somewhere ahead, which I guessed was the tunnel's own minimal flow from groundwater infiltration finding the grade. I went back to the hatch, came up, lowered it, relocked it, stood in the lock chamber for a moment. The tunnel was real. It was accessible. It was intact enough to walk through. Whether it was intact all the way to the exit at the river outfall, 2 miles of underground passage, I couldn't know without walking it. And whether the exit gate was openable was something else I couldn't know until I got there. But the tunnel existed. The tunnel was real. I went back to the station and told no one. I know that sounds wrong, but I needed another day to think. Here is what I was thinking about. In the 10 days since I'd been on the canals, I'd built something. Not just the physical station setup and the supply cache and the warning system, something else. A group, 7 people who were alive and functional because of the water. Nadia, who'd been on a fire escape for 3 days. The Brentwoods, who'd been down to a day's worth of food. Tyler, who'd been alone waiting to find out if he was going to stop being himself. They'd organized around the canals. They understood the water. They knew the paddle signals and the flag markers, and where the supply caches were, and how the station moved on the swing arm. They had a way of living that worked in this specific environment. Pulling them all underground into a brick tunnel for 2 miles was not obviously better than what they had. And there was the elevator group, Victor's 30-plus people. Getting 30 people through a 4-foot-wide tunnel without incident required everyone to be calm, organized, and quiet. I knew our 7. I didn't know the 30. And there was the question of who else might be out there, who I hadn't found yet, who might be findable if I stayed on the water and kept looking. And there was the question of who was operating the floodgates. That last one was becoming less optional, because on day 12, the same day I found the tunnel, I came across something on my northern patrol that I couldn't leave in the mental file anymore. At the Canal 4 junction with the navigation canal, there's a small maintenance access road that runs along the north bank. It's accessible from Chandler Road, which I'd been avoiding because the infected cluster was on Chandler. The access road is behind a fence from the canal bank, barely visible through the overgrowth on the bank edge. I'd paddled past it a dozen times without paying it much attention. On day 12, paddling past at about 6 in the morning in the fog, I saw a tire track in the mud at the bank edge. Fresh, maybe 12 hours old. The mud by the canal is always soft and holds tracks well. I know this from years of checking bank integrity. One set of vehicle tracks, in and out from the direction of Chandler Road. A vehicle with standard passenger car-sized tires, not a heavy vehicle. Someone had driven to the Canal 4 junction access road within the past 12 hours. In a city where the roads were blocked and the infected were concentrated on Chandler, someone had navigated to a specific, non-obvious access point on the canal system. Someone who knew the access point existed. I followed the tracks from the water as best I could, paddling slowly along the bank, trying to read what the mud was telling me. The vehicle had come from the north, stopped at the bank, and someone had gotten out and walked to the Canal 4 North Gate Control Panel, the gate control panel for Gate 4 North 1. I checked Gate 4 North 1. It had been operated. The actuator motor was warm. The gate was now at 70% open, which was forcing excess water from the Canal 4 upper section down toward the navigation canal and increasing flood pressure on the Mill Park area, the neighborhood I'd taken the Brentwoods out of 2 days before. Mill Park, which was adjacent to the Southgate area that was already flooding. And I realized something looking at the gate position and the tire tracks, and thinking about the overall pattern I'd been seeing for 10 days. Whoever was doing this wasn't just protecting Riverside Crest. They were actively managing the water. They were keeping it moving, keeping the flood shifting, and developing in ways that kept the infected population of the flooded neighborhoods in motion, displaced, moving west and north, away from the river. And they were doing it from a vehicle, using the canal maintenance access roads, which meant they had, or had taken, a city maintenance vehicle with the access codes to the canal system gates. City maintenance vehicle. City utility vests on the people who'd raided Victor's building. Someone had taken a city maintenance team and was using them to run the canal gates for their own purposes. And the most likely person who would have the authority to do that, who would have the access and the resources and a reason in their own mind to make this kind of decision, was someone at the top of the city emergency management structure. I needed to go to Riverside Crest. Going to Riverside Crest was a different kind of problem. The Riverside Crest waterfront was accessible from the navigation canal's south arm, but Gate 1 South 3, the one I'd identified as partially open to protect Riverside Crest's embankment, was in the way. I could pass through it at partial open, but barely, and coming back against the flow would require the outboard engine on a workboat, which I'd been avoiding using. Also, I had a group at the station who knew nothing about this specific plan. I went back and had an honest conversation with everybody. Not the tunnel, not yet, but the gate sabotage, the tire tracks, the vehicle, the people who'd raided the elevator group. I laid it out. Ray and Julie listened carefully. Nadia made notes. Victor, I'd called him on the radio. He'd been monitoring the handhelds I'd distributed, listened over the channel without speaking until I finished, then said, I wondered when you were going to say something about the gates. I said, you noticed? He said he'd noticed the flooding pattern. He said it didn't follow any natural hydraulic logic he could work out, even without knowing the canal system in detail. He said it looked managed. Cody, who was in the room, because Cody was always in the room during any conversation that was happening, said, like a video game, like someone is building walls with water. I said, yeah, actually kind of exactly like that. Victor said, do you know who? I said I didn't know for certain, but I had a theory, and I needed to go south to the Riverside Crest waterfront to test it. Victor said, I'm coming with you. Victor Strand could not kayak. He was a 53-year-old former bar manager, built like a piece of furniture, and he had never been in a kayak in his life. He could row. He could handle a flat-bottom workboat fine. He did not fit in my kayak and was not getting in it. I said I'd take the workboat. He said he'd meet me at the Canal 4 Junction access dock. He'd been getting across the canal from the elevator by a rope ferry system he'd rigged on day 4, and we'd take the southern route in the workboat together. I said, we go quiet. No motor unless absolutely necessary. He said, I can row. He could row. We went that afternoon, through the Gate 1 South 3 access, which I could work from the water using the manual override rod on the gate sill, a system I'd used many times during solo gate inspections. The gate opened enough for the workboat to pass through lying flat. The flow against us on the other side was manageable with oars. The Riverside Crest waterfront is a different visual world from the rest of Harwick's canal district. The canal side buildings are designed to be looked at. Riverside apartments, cafes, the arts center with its glass facade. Normally, the waterfront promenade would have people on it. Right now, it was silent, quiet, completely unflooded. The embankment was dry. The promenade was clear. The buildings intact. And there were people on the promenade. Not many. Maybe 15 or 20, visible from the water, some in groups, some alone. A couple of people in what looked like camp chairs outside one of the cafes, with what were clearly supplies laid out around them. Nobody looked panicked. Nobody was running. They saw us on the water. A man came to the promenade edge and called out, "Who are you, and where are you from?" I gave him my name and my job title. He said, "Waterways Department. Come in." We tied up at the promenade dock. The man who'd spoken was in his 40s, professional demeanor, the kind of person whose baseline posture is organizational authority. His name, he told us, was Davis Halloran. He said he was coordinating the Riverside Crest survivor community. He said they had about 60 people sheltering in the Riverside Crest complex and they were doing well. I asked about their power, their water. He said they had a generator. They'd gotten fuel from somewhere. He waved a hand vaguely toward the south. Water from the building systems, which were still pressurized. I asked about Roger Fassbender. I said it directly and watched his face. Something happened to his face when I said that name. Not guilt, exactly. More like the expression of someone who has been waiting for a question and isn't sure how much to admit about having been waiting. He said, "Mr. Fassbender is here. He's been coordinating resources." I said, "What kind of resources?" He said, "City emergency management resources. He has access to city vehicles and personnel, and he's been coordinating to keep the flood situation under control." Victor, next to me, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. A low, almost inaudible sound that meant he heard what I was hearing. I said, "I'd like to speak with him." Davis Halloran looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I'll see if he's available." He walked back along the promenade toward the Arts Center building. Victor and I stood at the dock. Victor said quietly, "I'm going to guess that Mr. Fassbender is the one who decided to flood Southgate." I said yes. He said, "And the people he sent in the city vests." I said those too. He said, "How do you want to play this?" I said, "Honestly, I don't think confrontation helps anyone right now. I think I want to know what he's doing, and what he knows about the city situation, and what his plan is. And I want him to know that someone outside his perimeter is watching the gates." Victor thought about that. He said, "You're going to tell him you know about the gates?" I said yes, because if I don't, he keeps doing it. And if he keeps doing it, the flooding moves in ways I can't predict, and eventually, it moves somewhere that doesn't help us. And because the next time he sends people in city vests to raid the grain elevator, I want him to know that I'm keeping track. Roger Fassbender came out to the promenade about 10 minutes later. He was 61, heavyset, the kind of man who wore authority like an overcoat that had been his for a long time. He'd been the city emergency management director for 8 years. I'd sat in 2 of his department coordination meetings. He didn't remember me from those meetings, but I remembered him. He came to the dock and looked at us with an expression that was managed, controlled, and not entirely comfortable. I told him what I knew. I didn't dress it up or approach it indirectly. I told him about the gate positions I'd observed, the tire tracks, the vehicle, the manual actuator temperatures. I told him about the pattern: Southgate flooding, Canal 7 industrial flooding, Riverside crest protection. I told him about the grain elevator raid. He listened. His face went through several different things while I talked. When I finished, he said, "I made a triage decision. The city infrastructure couldn't protect everything. Riverside crest had the highest elevation, the newest construction, the most defensible perimeter. It gave us the best chance of maintaining a survivable community." I said, "At the cost of flooding neighborhoods with people in them." He said, "People who were already in danger. The flooding displaced the infected outward. The people in those neighborhoods were better served by evacuation than by sheltering in place." I said, "The people I've been keeping alive in the Canal district weren't evacuated. They were stranded." A pause. He said, "I didn't have information about survivors in the Canal district." I said, "You had information about the canal gates. You operated them. Someone in a city vehicle was on the Canal 4 access road last night. If you're close enough to operate the gates, you're close enough to have looked for people." He looked at me. His jaw was doing something controlled and not happy. Victor said mildly, "We're not here to argue about what's done. We're here to talk about what happens next." I appreciated that from Victor more than I said at the time. Fassbender asked us what we were proposing. I said I wanted him to stop operating the floodgates without coordination with me. The current gate positions were creating water dynamics I was monitoring, and I needed them to be stable. Any changes to gate positions needed to come through me, because I was the only person currently monitoring the canal infrastructure. He asked what I was offering in exchange. I said information. Canal-level intelligence about the infected distribution, survivor locations, infrastructure condition. Things you couldn't get from the streets. He thought about this. He said, "You're the waterways inspector." I said yes. He said, "You've been out there since day one." I said yes. He said, more quietly, "How bad is it?" I said it was bad, but it wasn't absolute. There were systems working. There were survivors. There was a canal network that was providing a functional route through a city that was otherwise impassable. It was bad, but it wasn't over. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll stop the gate operations pending your assessment." I said thank you. And I meant it, technically, but also I meant it in the way that means I know this isn't over. Victor and I rode back through Gate 1 South 3 and north to the station. On the way, Victor said, "You didn't tell him about the tunnel." "No," I said. He said, "Because you don't trust him." I said, "Because I don't know what he does with information, and until I know what the tunnel actually looks like end to end, it's not information that helps anyone." Victor was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I want you to know that I'm going to follow your lead on this." I said I knew that. And then, because it was true, and because the canal at that moment was very quiet, and the city around us was its particular kind of terrible. And Victor was the kind of person you said true things to. I said I was glad he was here. He rode for a bit, then he said, "Yeah." We got back at dusk. Nadia had been watching from the station roof. She came down when we tied up. She had a look on her face that meant something had happened while we were gone. Tyler's bite wound. She'd done an evening assessment and the wound was healing. Not infected status healing, not turning. Healing. Normal human wound healing. The inflammation was down. The tissue around the wound margins was pink and new, rather than the color wounds go when they're going in the wrong direction. She said, "I don't know what this means for the broader outbreak, but this kid, in this specific case, the wound is healing the way a wound heals." Tyler was in the equipment room. I went in and sat across from him. I said, "Nadia tells me you're healing." He said, "Yeah. She keeps looking at me like I'm a math problem she's not sure she's solved." I said, "Is that okay?" He thought about it. He said, "It's better than being a math problem she's already solved wrong." I thought about that for a while afterward. 17. And here he was with this thing he was carrying, this possibly meaningful thing, sitting in a canal maintenance barge in a flooded city, making dry observations about being a medical curiosity. Some people have a way of metabolizing chaos that I don't fully understand, but recognize as real. Day 14. I went into the tunnel. I went alone. I told Nadia where I was going and when to expect me back, and what to do if I wasn't back in 4 hours. She wrote down the map grid reference for Lock 4 North without me asking her to. I went to the lock at 6 in the morning, opened the hatch, went down. The tunnel north of the lock was immediately different from the brief section I'd seen before. More air movement. The smell changed. More water, less stone. There was a thin channel of running water on the floor, maybe 2 inches deep, moving steadily north with a current I could feel against my boots. The brickwork was good for the first 400 meters. Tight mortar. No significant spalling. At the 500-meter mark, there was a section where the crown had settled. Not collapsed, but dropped maybe 4 inches, bringing the clearance to about 5'8". I had to duck slightly. I made a note. At the 800-meter mark, there was an access hatch in the ceiling, one of the maintenance hatches mentioned in the drawings. I pushed up on it, out of curiosity. Bolted from above. Didn't move. At 1 kilometer, the tunnel passed under the Chandler Road junction. I could hear, faintly, through the brick above me, feet, movement. The sound of things walking on a road surface, transmitted through 2 meters of earth and brick. Not rhythmic human footsteps. The characteristic shuffle of the infected, that dragging movement that I'd been hearing from canal banks for 2 weeks, coming through the ceiling muffled and hollow and strange. I stood still and listened for about 2 minutes. Then I kept going north. The tunnel north of the Chandler Junction got wetter. The floor water deepened to maybe 6 inches in one section, where there was clearly active groundwater infiltration through a crack in the invert, the floor of the tunnel. I marked that on my drawings. Wading through it was fine in my waders, but it was something to know about. At one point, 4 kilometers, I found something unexpected. A door. In the east wall of the tunnel, about 30 meters past an access hatch location, there was a steel door. Old, the same era as the tunnel construction. It was set into the brick with a frame and had a lever handle and was, I saw when I looked closely, unlocked. The lever wasn't secured by anything. I pulled it open. Behind the door, a room. Small, maybe 15 by 10 feet. Brick walls, a vaulted ceiling about 8 feet high. Empty, except for 2 things. A rusted iron shelf bracket on the west wall, and a large cast iron valve wheel mounted on the north wall, with pipe connections going up into the ceiling and east into the wall. This, I understood from the drawings, was one of the flood control valve stations for the secondary tunnel system, the points where city workers could close off sections of the tunnel during maintenance. The valve wheel was for the section north of this point. I tried the wheel. It turned, slowly, with the grinding resistance of long disuse. It moved. I turned it 3 full rotations and felt the resistance change, something upstream of the valve responding. I turned it back closed. The room was otherwise unremarkable, except that it was dry. The floor in this room was completely dry, which meant the groundwater infiltration I'd been walking through was on the south side of this valve position. Useful to know. I went back into the tunnel and kept north. At 2 kilometers, the brickwork changed to concrete, a later addition, probably from the 1971 revision. The concrete section was in better condition than the brick, newer, tighter, no infiltration. The floor was dry again. The ceiling height was more consistent. At 200 meters into the concrete section, I reached the end. The tunnel terminated at a steel plate wall, the exit. In the center of the steel plate was a gate assembly, a circular gate, about 3 feet in diameter, with a central handwheel. Around the handwheel was a mechanical seal mechanism, and, importantly, a single padlock on a hasp, connecting the handwheel to a bolt on the plate. The padlock was a standard commercial padlock, not a city infrastructure lock, a regular commercial one, the kind you'd buy at a hardware store. I looked at my bolt cutters. I'd brought them, slung across my back, because I'd brought them on every significant run since day one. I looked at the padlock. I thought, once I cut this, the tunnel goes from a secret to a decision. I stood there for a couple of minutes. I could hear, very faintly, through the steel plate, the sound of running water. The Harwick River, maybe 6 feet beyond the gate. I cut the padlock. The handwheel turned more easily than I expected. The mechanism was in good condition, well sealed, probably not exposed to the elements on the interior face. 3 full turns and the gate seal released. I pushed the gate outward. River air. Cold. Wet. Smelling of the river. Algae and silt and open water. The most different smell from the canal district I'd encountered in 2 weeks. Through the gate opening I could see the riverbank, concrete headwall, then a steep gravel slope down to the water, and beyond it, the Harwick River running fast with the spring volume, gray-green in the early morning light. North Bank. Outside the canal district, I'd estimated from the drawings that this exit was about a quarter-mile north of the Chandler Road Bridge, which put it north of the main infected cluster I'd observed. I couldn't see the Chandler area from here. It was around a river bend. What I could see was the riverbank north. Empty, wild, overgrown, no buildings, no roads visible. The industrial area on the east bank, visible across the river, looked dark and still. I pulled the gate back closed and stood inside the tunnel and let myself feel what I was feeling, which was a lot of things at once. Relief, first. The route existed. It was real. Then something harder, which was the weight of knowing that this information was now irrevocably mine. Mine to decide what to do with, and that the decision wasn't simple, and it wasn't going to become simple no matter how long I thought about it. I went back through the tunnel to Lock 4 North. I closed the hatch. I came up into the canal air, which smelled like oil and stone and moving water, which I now associated with safety in a way I hadn't on March 12th. I paddled back to the station. I told everyone. I sat them all down. Ray, Julie, Mia, Cody, Nadia, Tyler, and Victor by radio, and I went through the tunnel from the beginning. The drawings, the hatch in the lock, the assessment walk, the valve room, the exit gate, the river. I described it carefully, and let them ask questions, and answered everything honestly. The room was quiet for about 30 seconds after I finished. Then Cody said, "Can we go now?" Julie put her hand on his shoulder. Ray said, "What's your concern? About going now?" I said, "The tunnel is 2 kilometers. Parts of it have water on the floor. There's a low section that reduces clearance. The floor water is ankle to shin depth in the worst section. I can walk it. Mia can walk it with help. 6-year-old in 2 feet of cold water in a dark tunnel is... I'm not dismissing it. I'm just noting it." Julie said she could carry Mia. She said it without hesitation. I said, "The elevator group, Victor's people, 30-plus individuals." Victor, on the radio, "I've been counting on this problem." I said, "I know. We need a plan that isn't just us going through and sealing the hatch behind us." Nobody said anything to that. I said, "There's also Fassbender. He has 60 people in Riverside Crest, and he has city maintenance vehicles, and he has people who've already demonstrated they'll take resources by force. If he finds the tunnel, and if we start moving people through it, there's a chance he finds out about it. He might try to control the exit, or take the vehicles through, or make decisions about who goes through that I don't want him making. Tyler said, "Can the vehicles even fit in the tunnel?" I said, "No, the tunnel is 4 feet wide, nothing bigger than a person and a backpack." He said, "So the vehicles don't matter." I said, "The vehicles matter because they're what Fassbender uses to run the gate operations. Without them, he's just a person. With them, he's been managing the whole Canal District's water infrastructure for 2 weeks." Nadia said, "What do you actually want to do, Owen?" That landed the way direct questions do when someone asks you the one you've been orbiting. I said, "I want to assess the elevator group. I want to know if 30 people can make it through that tunnel in a single organized operation. I want to talk to Fassbender about the tunnel, but only once I've run the operation once, with a small group, and confirmed the exit conditions. And I want to do all of that in a way that doesn't result in 60 people from Riverside Crest stampeding an underground Victorian tunnel in the dark." Ray said, "So we go in 2 stages." I said, "Yes." He said, "Who goes first?" I looked around the room. I said, "Nadia takes Tyler and the Brentwoods through. You go first. The tunnel route, the riverbank, and then you go north along the river. Tyler knows boats. There are watercraft at the river outfall likely, or can be found close by on the river. Get north of the city and get somewhere defensible." Julie looked at me. She said, "What about you?" I said, "I come through after, with as many of Victor's people as want to go." Ray said, "Owen." I said, "I know." Ray said, "I don't think we should split up." I said, "I know, but someone needs to be on the canal side when the elevator group goes through, and I know the canal routes and nobody else here does, and someone needs to be on the riverside to receive them. That's you and Julie. Those 2 people need to be the right 2 people." Nobody argued with that because the logic was what it was, not because it was a comfortable answer. Nadia said, "What about Fassbender?" I said, "I'll tell him about the tunnel after the elevator group is through. Once there's nothing to control on the canal end except the hatch, he can take his 60 people through in as organized a way as he can manage. That's his problem. And the people who might still be out there. The ones I haven't found." I said, "I know. The signal markers. The colored flags on the canal banks that mark the supply drops. Anyone who finds them is going to keep looking and eventually find the station. The station will be empty by the time they get there. But the instruction note I'm going to leave on the station door is going to tell them about the lock and the hatch." I'd been thinking about that note for 2 days, actually. Victor said, "On the radio." "When?" I said, 72 hours. I need 3 days to prep the tunnel route for a larger group, mark the floor at the low points, cache some basic supplies at the valve room, get a rope guideline through the tricky section, and I want to run the route one more time in proper lighting conditions to make sure I haven't missed anything." Victor said, "I'll tell my people. Day 15 and 16 were preparation days. I'll give you the abbreviated version because some of this is technical, and the technical parts matter less than they feel like they do in the moment. I ran the tunnel twice more, once with Tyler, who was quiet and precise and useful at noting things I'd missed on the first pass. He spotted a section of the invert cracking that I'd walked over without registering, which was important, because that crack, if it let more groundwater in during a rain event, could raise the floor water level substantially. We didn't have a fix for it, but we noted it for timing purposes. On the second run, I strung a light rope along the tunnel wall on the right-hand side going north, a guideline, anchored at intervals to the brick with plastic channel clips from the maintenance kit. In the dark, at the low visibility section near Chandler, a rope to follow was going to matter. I cached 2 headlamps and a first aid kit in the valve room, plus 6 liters of water and some calorie-dense food from the elevator supply. Emergency stop point, if someone needed it. I also, on day 16, had my last patrol of the full canal circuit. I want to tell you about that patrol because it was the last time I saw Harwick from the water the way I'd been seeing it for 2 weeks, and I want to get it down right. I went out at 5 in the morning. Pre-dawn, the fog heavy and low, The kind of visibility where the canal walls disappear 6 feet out, and you're moving through a narrow tunnel of visible water and nothing else. The city above the fog sounded different at that hour. Not silent, because cities in crisis are never actually silent, but quieter. The characteristic sounds of this particular quiet: a crow somewhere east, the drip of condensation from the iron bridge above the Canal 4 junction, the slow movement of water through a partially open gate somewhere to the north, sounds I'd catalogued and could now read like a language. I paddled the full circuit: Navigation Canal, Canal 2, Canal 3, Canal 4, the partial Canal 7 to the bend. At each significant gate position, I checked the actuator temperature and position and wrote it in the notebook. Fassbender, to his credit, or possibly just to his self-interest, had kept the gates where I'd last seen them. The Mill Park flooding had stabilized. Southgate was still underwater, about 3 feet in the lower streets, but it wasn't increasing. The Canal 7 industrial section was holding. The Riverside Crest embankment was fine. The infected distribution had shifted somewhat in the past few days. The Chandler Road cluster was smaller. Some had drifted west, following what I could only guess were sound sources. The Marsh Road area cluster was still there, maybe slightly reduced. There were a handful of infected along the Canal 2 south bank that I hadn't seen before. A new cluster forming somewhere north, maybe drawn by something at the Mill Park area buildings. And then I paddled past something that stopped me dead in the water, and I sat there for a long time. On the north wall of the Navigation Canal, near the old ferry landing, the stone quay that dates back to the 1800s and has iron mooring rings set every 20 feet, there were hand marks on the stone. Low down, near the waterline, multiple sets of hand marks in what I could not tell from 10 feet away was mud or something else, pressed flat against the stone, at a height that was consistent with someone hanging off the iron rings and pulling themselves up. Someone, or multiple someones, had been trying to get out of the water at the ferry landing. Not recently. The marks were dried. Maybe day 2 or 3 material. But the shape of the marks, the position, someone in the water, grabbing a mooring ring, trying to pull up. A person in the water in the first days of this, trying to reach the stone quay. That was a survivor, or someone close to being one, who hadn't made it far enough from the water's edge. I sat with that for a while, then I paddled on. The world was going to be full of moments like that for a long time. I knew that. I'd known it since day 1, since the sound from the north on Canal 7 that I'd paddled away from. You make the arithmetic, and you go the direction the arithmetic points, and you live with what you didn't do. It's not the same as forgiveness, and it's not the same as guilt. It's something else that I don't have a word for yet. I finished the circuit and got back to the station at about 7:30. Everyone was up. Ray had food going on the camp stove. The smell of coffee and heated canned beans, which is not exactly a fine dining experience, but which I associate now with those mornings on the station, and will for the rest of my life. Mia was drawing something at the corner of the workbench. She'd found some drafting paper and the waterproof markers, and had been methodically drawing the station and the canal and things she saw from the platform. She'd labeled her most recent drawing, Whims for Canal Home, in large, careful letters. She showed it to me when I came in. I told her it was a very good map. She said it was a picture, not a map. I said she was right, sorry. We started moving people through the tunnel on day 17. The Brentwoods went first. Early morning. Fog still on the water. I paddled the kayak to Lock 4 North and met them there. They came on the workboat, Ray at the oars. Tyler was with them, Nadia. We went through the lock side door and down into the chamber, and I opened the hatch. The tunnel smell came up, cold and old and mineral. Mia looked down the stairs and said, "Are there bugs in there?" I said, "Probably, not many." She said, "Okay." She went down first, with her stuffed elephant. Tyler went next, then Cody, then Julie, then Ray, then Nadia. I came last, pulled the hatch down, locked it from below. The guide rope on the right wall. The headlamps on. 6 beams of light, making the brick walls into something almost cathedral, the way low light in enclosed old spaces tends to do. I kept my voice calm and matter of fact. narrating the route as we went. This is the low section. Duck your head here. The floor gets wet in about 100 meters. It's not deep. We walk straight through. The rope on the wall is there if you need it. Just keep moving north. Mia's hand was in Julie's. Cody was right behind his mother, one hand on the rope, moving steadily. Ray was behind Cody. Tyler was behind Ray. Nadia was behind Tyler. I was at the back. In the Chandler section, the sound of movement above. Everyone heard it. Nobody said anything. We kept moving. The sound tracked us slightly. We were moving, making small sounds of our own. Boots in water, the whisper of clothing against brick. But the sound above us didn't accelerate or concentrate. It was just there, the ambient sound of the infected moving on the surface. And we were below it, moving through old brick and groundwater toward the river. 22 minutes from the hatch to the exit gate. I know because Tyler was timing it. I opened the exit gate. River air came in. Mia said, "Oh," and I think that sound, that small "oh," is the thing I'm going to remember longest from that morning. The way she said it, not surprised, just receiving it. The smell of the river, the cold, the light. Oh. We came out onto the concrete headwall, then down the gravel slope to the river edge. The river was running fast and high. The north bank was completely empty as far as I could see. Low scrubland, some remnant industrial fencing, no buildings close by. The north bank of Harwick River above the city infrastructure was a narrow corridor of forgotten land, too steep for development, maintained by nobody, used occasionally by fishermen. It was the most open space I'd been in for 17 days. Ray turned around and looked at me. His expression was complicated. He said, "You're going back." I said, "I'll see you on the north bank by tomorrow night." He said, "You should know that's not reassuring enough." I said I knew. I gave him the drawings showing the outfall location on the riverbank map, the marked north bank route, and the cache coordinates I'd noted. I gave Nadia the last of the medical supplies I wasn't keeping for the tunnel operation. I gave Tyler my good headlamp and kept the spare. Julie hugged me. She didn't say anything. That was the right call. Mia gave me the elephant for about 4 seconds, and then took it back, which was also the right call. Cody put his hand out, and I shook it, because that's what you do with a 9-year-old who shakes your hand. He said, "Leave a note about the tunnel for anyone who needs it." I said I would. I went back through the tunnel alone. The return trip in the dark, walking south, alone, different, quieter. The guide rope under my right hand, the headlamp beam going ahead of me, the sound of my own boots in the shallow water section. The Chandler overhead again, the movement sounds above me, the ceiling of brick between me and whatever was up there. I thought about a lot of things walking back through that tunnel. I thought about the first time I came to Harwick, which was for a job interview for this exact job, City Waterway Maintenance Inspector, 14 years ago. I'd come by train and walked from the station to the municipal building and past the navigation canal on the way, and stopped and stood at the bridge railing and looked at the water for a while, because I was early, and there was no reason not to. I thought about what the canal had looked like that day. Still, greenish. A heron standing on the far bank, absolutely motionless. The sound of the city all around it. The canal just there, doing what canals do, which is hold water and move it, and be patient about the whole business. I thought about Diane. I do that more in the dark. I think about what she's doing, whether she got out, whether she found someone to be with in this. We were good people to each other for 8 years, and then we were good people to each other who happened to not be married anymore, and I'd made my peace with that, mostly. I hope she got north. I hope she found somewhere safe and warm, and found the people she needs around her. I thought about you, Tim. I always think about you in the dark. You'd have hated this situation, which means you'd have been absolutely competent at it, because you always perform best when you're doing something you hate. I don't know why that's true of you, but it is. I came out the hatch into the lock chamber, closed the hatch, locked it, left the brass key on the ledge of the lockkeeper's platform with a note that said, in large waterproof marker letters, "Tunnel access. City of Harwick Canal System. North Bank exit. Use this key. Ask at WIMS-4 for guidance." Signed it. Added the date. Then I paddled back to the station. Victor was there. He'd come across the canal rope ferry 2 hours earlier when I hadn't checked in. He was sitting on the platform with his arms on his knees, and his face doing what Victor's face does when he's been worried, which is a very quiet, very contained kind of worried. He said, "They're through?" I said they were through. He said, "Right. Then let's get my people." Moving 34 people from the grain elevator through the canal system to Lock 4 North was a coordination problem of a different scale from anything I'd done in the previous 17 days. Victor had been prepping for it. He'd organized his group into 4 cohorts of roughly 8 or 9, each with a designated leader, each with a pack prepared. He'd explained the route, the tunnel, the expected conditions. He'd been on a canal coordination channel with me for 2 days working through the logistics. The problem was crossing the canal from the elevator to the Lock 4 North side. The elevator was on the south bank of Canal 3. Lock 4 North was on Canal 4, accessible from the north bank of the navigation canal. That meant 3 waterway crossings to get from the elevator to the lock, and crossing on foot wasn't possible in the flood conditions. We used every boat we had. The 2 workboats, the Kayak, and a flat-bottom aluminium that Victor's group had found and brought to the canal access over the past week. 4 boats, 4 crossings per cohort, 8 trips per boat. I managed the coordination from the Kayak, moving between crossing points, reading the infected positions on the banks. It took 4 hours. The fog helped for the first 2 hours, and then burned off, which was not ideal. The 3rd cohort crossing was in full daylight, which meant we were running on quiet boat operation and the infected track sound principle, rather than low visibility. Victor's people were good. They were scared, some of them, and tired, all of them, but they were disciplined in the way that 30-plus people who've been running a community together for 2 weeks in a grain elevator develop discipline. They listened to their cohort leaders. They kept quiet when it mattered. They moved when I called the crossing. I had 2 close calls in those 4 hours. The first was during the 2nd cohort crossing. An infected individual appeared on the South Canal 3 bank from somewhere upstream and walked straight toward the noise of the workboat crossing. We were mid-crossing, 8 people in 2 boats. I pulled the Kayak in front of the approaching infected and slapped the water surface hard. That flat hand slap on water makes a sharp, localized noise, and the infected turned toward it. I paddled hard east, staying ahead of it, drawing it away from the crossing. It followed the sound for about 60 meters before stopping at a point where the bank curved and the current was loud enough to confuse it. I got clear. The second was during the 4th cohort crossing. One of Victor's people, a woman in her 50s, a school teacher named Fran Holder who I'd never spoken to but knew from Victor's roster, slipped on the workboat gunwale getting in and went into the canal. Not far, not deep. She was up to her waist and grabbed the gunwale, and the person next to her got her arm immediately. But she went in, and she made noise, and there was a cluster of infected on the north bank of the navigation canal, about 100 meters west. Every head turned west. Victor's group in the boat went completely still. The infected had heard the splash. They were moving east along the bank, slowly, tracking. The current in the navigation canal was running at maybe 2.5 miles an hour with the spring flow. The noise location was moving east, carried by the water sound. By the time the infected got to where they thought it had come from, they reached the point where Fran had fallen in and stopped and milled in that eddying, purposeless way they had when sound was confusing or had ended. We held still for 4 full minutes. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Fran Holder, waist-deep in March Canal water with both hands on the gunwale, and the patience of a woman who has taught classrooms for 30 years, held completely still for 4 minutes. The infected drifted back west. We completed the crossing. All 34 of Victor's people in the lock chamber by early afternoon. I'd opened the hatch. Victor went down first with a headlamp and came back up and said, "It's fine, let's go." They went through in 2 groups of 17. I ran the south group down. One of Victor's cohort leaders ran the north group through behind them. I went last again. Standing in the tunnel at the back of the second group, listening to 34 people moving north through old brick in the dark, their headlamp beams making the tunnel walls into a long moving light show, the rope along the right wall pulled taut from so many hands. It was one of the stranger things I've experienced. and the past 17 days had been full of strange things. We came through the exit gate into the river air. 34 people standing on the north bank of the Harwick River in the late afternoon light, looking at each other, and then at the empty riverbank, and then at the water. The Brentwoods were there. They'd made a camp of sorts. Tarps rigged from the fencing, a fire going carefully, in a cut-bank depression, below the sight line, food from the cache I'd marked. Ray stood up when the group came through the gate. He and Victor had never met. They shook hands with the particular grip of two people who've been problem-solving toward the same end without knowing it. Tyler was on the river, in a small aluminum flat bottom he'd found moored to the outfall fence. A fisherman's boat left here, probably since before all this, with a small engine and enough fuel for 20 miles. He'd been on a supply-gathering run north. He waved from the boat when the group came through. I stayed at the exit gate. I had one more thing to do. I went back through the tunnel, south. The south side of the tunnel, alone, no group sounds. Just my headlamp and the guide rope and the water on the tunnel floor. I came up through the hatch one more time, through the lock chamber, out into the Canal 4 air. I paddled to the station. I took everything useful from the station that I could carry in the kayak, and both workboats, the map binder, the bolt cutters, the remaining food and water, the radio, the tools that would matter, drill, bolt cutters, wire kit. I left the heavy items, the fuel drums, the hydraulic equipment, the things that were too heavy for the tunnel or the river. On the station door I put a note, in large waterproof marker letters, Wims Cunner 4 Canal Station. If you found this and you're alive, here's what to do. Below that, the canal supply cache locations, the Lock 4 North location, and the tunnel access instructions, the brass key description, and where to find it. I'd put a second note at the lock, and I put a third one at the station, referencing both. The riverbank camp location, with a rough north bank trail sketch. The signal method for the camp, 3 fires in a triangle, visible from the river. Below that, infected do not swim, stay on the water, move slow and quiet, you can do this. I took one last look at the station, the corrugated roof, the oil smell, the strip light still burning on the bank power connection, which was frankly miraculous at this point, the roll-up door, the map binder slot in the cabinet where the map had been. I got in the kayak. I had a decision to make. Fassbender. I paddled south to the Gate 1 South 3 approach, and I called out from the water in the direction of the Riverside Crest Promenade. A figure appeared on the bank. Davis Halloran, the coordinator. He called down to me. I asked for Fassbender. Fassbender came out. We talked from about 20 feet of water between us. I stayed in the kayak and didn't dock. I told him about the tunnel. All of it. The entrance at Lock 4 North. The key. The route. The exit. I told him where the notes were. I told him that our group had already gone through and that the south end of the tunnel was accessible from the lock, and the exit gate was open, and the north bank was clear. He was quiet. Then he said, "You're not coming back." I said no. He said, "Why are you telling me?" I said, "Because you have 60 people who need a way out. The tunnel is that way. I'm not going to decide who gets to know about it." He said, "You could have gone without telling me." I said, "I know." He said something I didn't fully hear, then said more clearly, "What about the gates? If we all go, who maintains the flood control?" I said, "Nobody. The water does what water does. That's how this was always going to end up." He looked at me for a moment from the promenade. Then he said, "Those people in the elevator, the raid." I said, "They're already through. They're north." He said, "I'll deal with the people who did that." I said, "Yeah, do that." He nodded. I paddled away. I didn't look back. I know that sounds deliberate, and it is slightly deliberate, but mostly it was because looking back at Harwick from the water at that point was going to make the next 2 miles very hard, and I needed those 2 miles to go well. I went back to Lock 4 North for the last time. I dropped the kayak in the lock chamber. I wasn't taking it through the tunnel, and there wasn't a practical way to get it to the river end, and went down the hatch with both workboats worth of supplies in a pack on my back and a rope harness on the second pack dragging behind me. I closed the hatch. I locked it. I left the brass key in the lock as I'd planned. I walked north, guide rope on the right, headlamp ahead, the packs heavy on my back and dragging. The low section at Chandler, the duck and keep moving, the sound above me. The wet floor section, ankle deep, then dry. The valve room where I stopped and checked the cache. The concrete section, better footing, the last stretch. The exit gate, the hand wheel, 3 turns, river air. I came out onto the concrete headwall with the packs and stood there for a moment, doing what you do when you've been in a tunnel for 24 minutes with 40 kilos of supplies, and you come out into the open air. Breathe. Just breathe, and let the open space hit you. The camp was 300 meters north along the bank. I could see smoke from the fire, kept low and careful, and I could see figures at the river edge. Tyler in the flat bottom, Ray standing at the bank, and someone shorter next to Ray who was too far to see clearly, but who I could see was waving. I waved back. I pulled the exit gate closed behind me. From the outside, the gate looked like a drainage outfall headwall. It blended into the concrete embankment. You'd have to know to look for it. I walked north. The camp was not comfortable. I want to be clear. 34 people and the Brentwood family on a gravel and scrub riverbank in March, with tarps and a low fire. People were cold and tired, and some of them were dealing with things I hadn't had full visibility into. 2 older individuals in Victor's group who needed more rest than the journey had allowed. A man who'd been dealing with a respiratory infection for days and was getting worse. A woman who'd been managing her anxiety against the edge of its management capacity for 2 weeks and was beginning to come over that edge. Nadia was moving between all of them, methodical and calm, her medical kit open on a flat rock. But there were also people eating, talking. Mia Brentwood was showing her canal drawing to a circle of 3 other children who'd come through with the elevator group. Tyler had his flat bottom moored to an improvised dock, 2 fence posts and a plank, and was showing 2 of Victor's teenage boys how to handle the oars. Victor himself was at the fire with Ray, and they were doing what those 2 people do, which is making a list. A practical, organized, prioritized list of what the group needed in the next 12 hours, tomorrow, and the day after. I sat down next to them and said, "What's on the list?" Victor handed it to me. The list was 2 pages. Some of it was immediate, shelter, warmth, medical. Some of it was medium term, food beyond the cache, fresh water, a defensible overnight position. Some of it was longer, the kind of problems that only arise when you have 36 people committed to staying alive together, rather than individually. At the bottom of the 2nd page, Victor had written 1 line under a gap. "What comes next for the canal notes?" with a question mark. I asked him what he meant. He said, "You know a lot about how to survive on the water, how to move through an infected zone, the supply cache system, the warning systems, the ways the infected behave near water. Might be more people who need that." I looked at the list. Then I looked at the river, the north bank, the empty scrubland, the water moving south past us toward the city we'd come from. I said, "Yeah, I've been recording it, since day 1. He said, "Good. Then we've got something to give people when we find them." I looked at the recorder. This recorder, Tim. The yellow one in my vest pocket. The one I've been talking into this whole time. The battery indicator was still not critical. I'd been rationing the recordings, keeping them tight, but there was still space on it. I said, "I should probably wrap this up then." Victor said, "Probably." I thought about what to say to finish this, and then I thought that finishing it wasn't quite right. It wasn't finished, obviously. 36 people on a riverbank wasn't an ending, it was a camp, and north of us was wherever we were going next, which we hadn't determined yet. And behind us, in the city, there were maybe 60 more people who might be coming through a brick tunnel tomorrow. And whatever was in the tunnel in the other direction, the city they'd left behind, was still doing what it was doing, which would keep doing it whether anyone was recording it or not. The last thing I want to tell you, Tim, the last thing that's actually a conclusion rather than just where the recording ends, is this. I spent 14 years learning the canals. I measured flow rates and checked seal integrity. and wrote up crack assessments, and argued with the budget committee about maintenance schedules, and drove the access roads in the gray light of city mornings when nobody else was awake yet. I did all of that, and I thought I was doing a job. I was doing a job, but I was also, without knowing it, learning something that turned out to be necessary, for reasons that had nothing to do with canal maintenance. That's probably true of a lot of things. I think you know that better than I do, actually. You were always the one who said pay attention to what you know, because you don't know what you're going to need it for. You said that when we were kids, when I thought it was kind of a dorky thing to say, and I thought about it every day for the past 3 weeks. I'm going to call it there. Not because it's over, but because the recorder battery isn't infinite, and there are other things that need doing, and the list has 2 pages, and we're burning daylight here. If you find this, Tim, if someone finds this, and you're somewhere out there, and this makes it to you, I want you to know that I made that call eventually. In my head, in the tunnel, walking north with the pack on my back. I made the call I should have made before all this started, and I said what I should have said, which is that I'm sorry for the 2 years, and I miss you, and I hope you're somewhere safe and warm with people around you. That's it. That's the whole call. You can probably guess the rest. I'm going to go help with the list now. This is Owen Delaney, City of Harwick Waterway Maintenance Inspector. Day 18, North Bank Camp, Harwick River. 36 people alive.